It was a regular Tuesday afternoon when the world got its wake-up call. In every city, on every screen, a message flashed across the globe. A 9-year-old has found the cure for plastic pollution. Charlie Anderson, a quiet girl from a small town in California, had no idea that her simple school science project would make her a household name overnight. She had never set out to change the world. She just wanted to fix a problem she'd seen with her own eyes. For as long as she could remember, Charlie had been captivated by the ocean. Its beauty, its mystery, and, more than anything, its suffering. The oceans were suffocating under mountains of plastic, and no one seemed to know how to stop it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. It was a problem that haunted her every time she visited the beach with her mother. They would walk along the shore, collecting plastic bottles, bags, and wrappers that washed up with each tide. At school, Charlie would often daydream about how she could solve the crisis. But it wasn't until she got her hands on some old lab equipment in the school science lab that her dream began to take shape. Using a simple enzyme she'd engineered herself, Charlie discovered a way to break down plastic at an astonishing rate. The results were so unexpected, so incredible, that she could hardly believe it herself. Her invention, a biological enzyme capable of breaking down plastic within hours, was not just an academic curiosity. It was a solution that could end the plastic crisis forever. Charlie had always been a smart kid, but even she never imagined this project would change the course of history. The news spread like wildfire. At first, people thought it was a hoax. A 9-year-old with a solution for something that experts had been struggling with for decades? Impossible. But Charlie had the proof. With the help of her mother, who supported every little step of her scientific journey, she published her findings online. Within hours, the story went viral. Scientists, environmentalists, even world leaders began reaching out. It wasn't just a breakthrough. It was the answer to one of humanity's most pressing problems. But amid the praise, there was another voice, one that grew louder and louder. A voice that wasn't satisfied with simply admiring her work. Elon Musk. The name sent a ripple through the scientific community. The billionaire inventor, known for his work with SpaceX and Tesla, was not one to back down from a challenge. And he had one question. What if it doesn't work in the real world? Musk was skeptical, but intrigued. The world had seen too many miracles in science that fell apart when they were put to the test on a global scale. Elon Musk didn't believe in miracles. He believed in results. And so, Musk did what he always did. He made an offer. He wanted to meet Charlie Anderson in person. He wanted to see if this 9-year-old's invention could truly change the world. Or, perhaps, if it would be another false hope that would disappear just as quickly as it appeared. The world held its breath. Charlie, a young girl with big dreams and an even bigger heart, was about to meet one of the most powerful people on Earth. The stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. If Elon Musk embraced her invention, it would be a turning point for humanity. If he dismissed her, the world would question whether this was all just another empty promise. The announcement of the meeting made headlines around the world. TV shows, news stations, and social media were ablaze with discussions. Some said Elon Musk was going to try to take over the technology and use it for his own gain. Others believed he was going to crush her dreams. But one thing was certain. No one knew what would happen next. As the days ticked down to the meeting, Charlie felt a mixture of excitement and fear. She had dreamed of meeting Musk for years, ever since she first read about him in a book about innovators. But now, the reality of the situation was sinking in. It wasn't just a meeting with a famous billionaire. It was a moment that could define the future of the planet. Charlie wasn't nervous about the technology. She knew it worked. She wasn't even nervous about the media. What worried her most was the pressure of what was at stake. Her discovery could change the world, but would she have the courage to face a man like Elon Musk? Would she be able to stand firm in her belief that her invention was worth fighting for? The day of the meeting arrived, and Charlie stood in front of the SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California, clutching her mother's hand. The gates of the massive complex seemed to tower over them, but Charlie was determined. She had come this far, and she wouldn't back down now. As they stepped inside, a sense of awe washed over Charlie. The hallways were lined with futuristic technology, sleek machines that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. They were led into a large conference room where Elon Musk was waiting. He looked just as Charlie had imagined, intense, focused, yet oddly approachable. He gave her a small smile as she entered, but there was no mistaking the calculating look in his eyes. He wasn't here to congratulate her. He was here to evaluate. "Charlie," he began, his voice smooth and measured, "I've heard a lot about you. Your discovery is remarkable, but I have a few questions." Charlie nodded, her heart racing. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. "You've created an enzyme that breaks down plastic. Great," Musk continued. "But what happens when it's scaled up? What happens when it's used in real-world applications? Can it really handle the amount of plastic that's out there? And what about the byproducts? Have you thought of those?" Charlie took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't her first time facing tough questions. She had spent countless hours in her garage lab with her mom, testing and retesting her enzyme. She had answers, and she was ready to provide them. "Elon," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction, "I've thought of everything. I've done the tests. The enzyme works, and it breaks down plastic in a matter of hours without harmful byproducts. It's safe. I know it's ready for the world." Musk raised an eyebrow. "You're confident?" "Absolutely," Charlie said, her eyes meeting his. "And I know it's going to work. I've seen it with my own eyes." For a moment, there was silence between them. Elon leaned back in his chair, observing her with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He didn't often meet people like Charlie, young, fearless, and determined. But there was something about her that intrigued him. Maybe it was her unshakable belief in her invention, or maybe it was the way she looked at him, not with awe, but with the certainty that she knew exactly what she was talking about. "All right," Musk said, breaking the silence. "Let's put it to the test." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. There was no turning back. "Let's see if you're right." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Charlie Anderson wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth. In fact, she had never really known what it was like to live in a mansion or to be surrounded by luxury. But she had something far more valuable, a mother who believed in her. Her mom, Maggie Anderson, was a single parent who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Maggie wasn't a scientist, but she always encouraged Charlie's curiosity. When other parents would discourage their kids from playing around with chemicals or wasting time with experiments, Maggie simply smiled and said, "You never know what you might discover." Charlie's fascination with the natural world started young. When she was 5, she found a dead seagull on the beach during a family outing. The bird had been tangled in a plastic bag, and it had died because it couldn't escape. For a little girl, the sight was terrifying and heart-wrenching, and it haunted her for years. That was the moment Charlie knew she had to do something about the plastic pollution in the oceans. By the time she was 8, Charlie's obsession had grown. She read every article, watched every documentary, and even began experimenting with ways to recycle and reduce waste. She wasn't just another kid with a dream. She was a young scientist with a mission. Her mother supported her every step of the way, providing her with materials and space to work in their small garage-turned-laboratory. Maggie wasn't a scientist, but she was a brilliant mentor. She taught Charlie the importance of persistence, of asking the hard questions, and, most of all, of never backing down in the face of adversity. Despite the financial struggles and the long hours Maggie worked, she always made time for Charlie. They spent countless nights together, poring over science books and watching old documentaries about environmentalists who had made a difference. At school, Charlie was known as the quiet girl with her nose in a book. She wasn't interested in typical kid stuff. While the other children played sports or obsessively discussed the latest pop stars, Charlie could often be found in the library, researching ways to clean up the environment. Her classmates thought she was strange, but Charlie didn't mind. They didn't understand her the way her mother did, and that was enough for her. But one person did take notice of Charlie's potential, Dr. James Bradley, a local environmental scientist who volunteered his time to mentor young people interested in science. Dr. Bradley had heard rumors about a young girl who was doing remarkable things with plastic waste, and one afternoon, he showed up at Charlie's house, eager to meet her. "Your mother tells me you're trying to solve the plastic problem," Dr. Bradley said, shaking her hand. Charlie was hesitant at first. She'd never met someone so accomplished in her field. He seemed like a giant in the world of science, and here she was, a 9-year-old girl who had only just begun her journey. But Dr. Bradley was different from the others. He didn't doubt her ability, and he didn't dismiss her ideas as childish. Instead, he asked questions, encouraged her experiments, and shared his knowledge of the scientific community. He even helped her get access to better lab equipment through his network. Over the next year, their partnership grew, and Dr. Bradley became her mentor, guiding her through the complexities of science and the practicalities of creating real-world solutions. Under his mentorship, Charlie's ideas flourished. She learned about enzymes, catalysts, and chemical reactions. When she first came across the concept of using biological agents to break down waste, she became obsessed. She spent hours in their makeshift lab, trying out different formulas, measuring results, and making adjustments. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. There was always another variable, another challenge to overcome. That was until she stumbled upon a breakthrough. Charlie was doing a simple experiment one afternoon when, after adding a specific type of enzyme to a plastic sample, she saw something extraordinary. The plastic began to degrade, rapidly breaking down into smaller, harmless components. She had discovered a way to accelerate the process by using a specific enzyme that could target plastic molecules. In her excitement, Charlie hadn't even realized what she had done at first. She stared at the reaction in awe as the plastic vanished before her eyes. It was the kind of moment that every scientist dreams of, when an idea finally clicks and leads to something incredible. For Charlie, it felt like the universe had aligned, but it also felt terrifying. She had never expected to come up with something so big, so important. Her first instinct was to call Dr. Bradley, but he wasn't the first person she told. She ran to her mom instead. Maggie had been at work when Charlie made the discovery, but when she came home to find her daughter jumping up and down with excitement, she couldn't help but smile. "What is it, sweetie?" "I've done it, Mom. I've figured out how to break down plastic." Charlie's voice was nearly a squeak as she tried to contain her excitement. Maggie looked skeptical at first, but when Charlie showed her the experiment, her eyes widened. She had always known her daughter was brilliant, but this was something beyond her wildest dreams. Over the next few weeks, they refined the enzyme, ensuring that it was safe and effective. But Charlie knew she couldn't keep it a secret. As much as she wanted to protect her idea, the world needed to know. So, with Dr. Bradley's help, they published their findings, and the response was immediate. As the story began to spread, Charlie's life changed forever. Scientists contacted her for interviews, environmental groups wanted to partner with her, and governments began to express interest. But Charlie knew the biggest challenge was still ahead. There were questions, so many questions. Could this actually be scaled up? Would it work on a global level? What about the cost? And then there was Elon Musk. When Charlie heard that Musk wanted to meet her, she was both flattered and terrified. She had watched his interviews and read about his ventures in space, electric cars, and renewable energy. But now, she was about to sit face to face with him, an inventor, a visionary, and a billionaire who could change the course of her invention's future. As Charlie prepared for the meeting, she reflected on how far she had come. From a curious girl collecting plastic on the beach to a 9-year-old whose discovery could save the planet. She had always known there was more to life than just going to school and playing with friends. She had a purpose now, a purpose that was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. And yet, as she stared at the invitation to SpaceX, Charlie couldn't help but wonder. Would Elon Musk believe in her idea? Would he take her seriously? Or would this be the moment that the world turned its back on her? The morning of the meeting with Elon Musk, Charlie woke up feeling like a million butterflies were fluttering inside her stomach. She barely slept the night before. No matter how much she tried to calm herself, her nerves got the better of her. But there was no backing out now. This meeting wasn't just an opportunity. It was her chance to prove that her discovery could change the world. Her mother, Maggie, was already awake when Charlie entered the kitchen. She was standing at the counter, making a cup of coffee, but when she saw her daughter's pale face, she smiled warmly. "Big day ahead, huh?" Maggie asked, setting down the coffee mug and walking over to Charlie. Charlie nodded but didn't say anything. It felt like her words had gotten stuck somewhere in her chest. Maggie cupped Charlie's face in her hands, her gentle eyes locking with her daughter's. "Remember, sweetheart, no matter what happens today, you've already done something incredible. You're already changing the world." Maggie's voice was filled with such fierce love and pride that Charlie's stomach eased just a little. Charlie hugged her mother tightly. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done any of this without you." They shared a moment, but it didn't last long. Charlie had an early flight to catch, and the time was ticking. She had only a few hours before she would step into the belly of the SpaceX headquarters, a place where the biggest minds in science and technology collided. A place where a 9-year-old girl would have to face one of the most influential men on Earth. It felt surreal. As they drove to the airport, Charlie couldn't help but think about the magnitude of the situation. Elon Musk had reached out personally, not because he believed in her idea, but because he doubted it. He was a man who had built empires by solving impossible problems, and now, here he was, questioning the work of a young girl. She couldn't help but feel the weight of that. He had built rockets and electric cars, but was he really the right person to judge her invention? But there was another side to Charlie's mind, a part of her that refused to be intimidated. After all, this wasn't just any challenge. This was the challenge. If her invention was everything she believed it to be, then it would stand up to any scrutiny. Musk wasn't the enemy. He was the gatekeeper. He could either open the door to her future or shut it down. But Charlie wasn't going to let fear take over. She would walk into that room and face him with everything she had. The flight to Los Angeles felt endless, but when Charlie finally arrived at the SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, she could hardly contain her excitement. She had seen the building on TV before, but now she was here, about to meet the man whose name had become synonymous with innovation and technological revolution. SpaceX's sprawling campus was a futuristic wonderland, filled with sleek steel buildings, solar panels, and a palpable sense of possibility. As Charlie and Maggie drove through the entrance, she couldn't help but marvel at how different everything seemed. It was like a scene from one of the science fiction books she had read. And now, she was standing at the intersection of science fiction and reality. Inside, they were escorted to a conference room where Elon Musk was waiting. The door opened, and Charlie found herself face to face with the man who had changed the landscape of transportation, space exploration, and clean energy. He was sitting at the head of the table, reviewing a stack of papers. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't stand. Instead, he gave her a polite nod. "Charlie," he said, his voice calm but piercing. "It's good to meet you." Charlie shook his hand, but she didn't sit down right away. She stood there for a moment, just taking him in. The man who had sent rockets into space, the billionaire who was trying to colonize Mars, was now about to test her invention. The pressure was immense, but Charlie didn't let it show. She had prepared for this moment for months, and she was ready. "Thank you for meeting me," Charlie said, her voice steady but firm. "I appreciate the chance to show you what I've discovered." Musk gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, take a seat. I'm curious to see what you've got." As Charlie sat down, Maggie took her place beside her, her supportive presence like an anchor in the storm of Charlie's nerves. Musk didn't waste any time. He got right to the point. "Let's start with the basics. You say you've created an enzyme that can break down plastic. That sounds too good to be true. Tell me how it works." Musk's gaze was sharp, his mind clearly analyzing every word she said. Charlie took a deep breath. This was it. She had to explain everything clearly, without hesitation. "I used a combination of natural enzymes that have the ability to break down the bonds in plastic polymers," Charlie began, using the language she had spent years mastering. "The enzyme targets the carbon-carbon bonds in plastics, causing them to break down into smaller, biodegradable molecules. The process is fast, and the best part is there are no toxic byproducts. It's completely safe." Musk raised an eyebrow. "And you've tested this, right? Not just in the lab, but in real-world conditions?" "Absolutely," Charlie replied. "I've tested it on all types of plastics, PET, PVC, and even polystyrene. It works in varying temperatures, and the enzyme is biodegradable itself. I've tested it in soil and water, and it doesn't cause any harm to the environment. It's the first step in solving the plastic crisis. Musk leaned back in his chair, clearly skeptical. He tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. That's impressive. But I have to ask, what's the scalability? You've managed to make this work in a lab, but how do you scale it to handle the billions of tons of plastic in the world? What about the logistics of mass production? The cost? Charlie knew these questions were coming. Everyone had asked the same thing, but she wasn't afraid. The enzyme can be produced relatively cheaply using fermentation methods, she explained. It's scalable, and because it works so quickly, we can process larger quantities of plastic much faster than current recycling methods. We could deploy it globally in a matter of years if the right investments are made. The more we produce it, the cheaper it becomes. Musk's expression was hard to read, but Charlie could see the wheels turning in his mind. And what happens when this enzyme gets out of control? He asked, leaning forward. What if it starts breaking down things it shouldn't, like vital infrastructure, buildings, or even natural resources? Charlie had anticipated this concern. The enzyme is highly specific, she explained. It only targets plastics and certain synthetic materials. It doesn't affect natural substances like wood, metal, or living organisms. I've run several tests to make sure it only targets the plastic polymers. Musk nodded, though his expression remained cautious. You've done a lot of work on this, Charlie, he said after a long pause. But I still have my doubts. I want to see it in action. I want to see if it really works as well as you say it does. Charlie's heart raced. This was it, the test that would either make or break her invention. I can show you, she said, rising from her seat. I've brought the sample with me. Charlie's heart pounded in her chest as she retrieved the small, carefully sealed vial from her bag. It contained a concentrated form of the enzyme she had spent the last year perfecting. The vial was no bigger than a soda can, but inside was something far more powerful than anything Elon Musk had ever encountered. At least, that's what she hoped. As she placed the vial on the conference table, she could feel Musk's eyes on her, scrutinizing every move. There was no room for failure, no time for second chances. This was the moment when everything she'd worked for would either be validated or dismissed as just another fantasy. All right, let's see it, Musk said, his voice calm. But the challenge in his tone was unmistakable. Charlie opened the vial slowly and carefully, her hands steady despite the pressure. She wasn't nervous, not anymore. She had practiced this demonstration in her makeshift lab back home 100 times. The steps were second nature to her now. She had seen this enzyme break down plastic again and again. But this wasn't just any demonstration. This was her future, and the world's future. Reaching for a small piece of plastic, an old, crumpled plastic bottle she brought with her, Charlie placed it on the table. It was dirty, weathered, and covered in grime, just like so many of the bottles that littered beaches and landfills across the planet. The plastic had already lived a long, unfortunate life, but this was its last moment. Are you ready? She asked, looking at Musk. Her voice was steady, but a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. Would it work? Musk nodded, folding his hands in front of him. Go ahead. Charlie poured a few drops of the enzyme solution onto the plastic. Almost immediately, there was a soft bubbling sound, the reaction beginning as the enzyme made contact with the plastic. The transformation started slowly, like a gentle ripple across the surface, but then it began to accelerate. The plastic began to break apart, shredding into small, irregular fragments as the enzyme consumed it. Musk leaned in closer, his sharp gaze fixed on the plastic as it dissolved. His usual composed demeanor shifted just slightly, a flicker of interest appearing in his eyes. That's remarkable, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone in the room. Charlie watched with bated breath, her pulse quickening as the plastic began to dissolve more rapidly. Within minutes, the once solid piece was reduced to a sticky, gelatinous mass. In less than 5 minutes, it was gone, completely disintegrated into harmless molecules. The room was silent for a long moment. Charlie's eyes were fixed on the spot where the plastic had been moments before, now only a faint residue left on the table. She could feel Musk's gaze on her, but she didn't dare look up. Her chest tightened, waiting for his judgment. Finally, Musk spoke. "That's incredible," he said, his voice quieter than usual. His eyes didn't leave the now empty space on the table. "It really worked." Charlie's breath caught in her throat. She could hardly believe it herself. The reaction had been so fast, so efficient. It wasn't just a success, it was a revolution. But Elon Musk wasn't one to simply be impressed. He had seen plenty of innovations come and go. And as much as he respected anyone who could break new ground, he wasn't the kind of person to get swept up in hype. "You've shown me that it works in the lab," Musk said, finally looking up from the table to meet Charlie's eyes. "But the real test isn't just whether it works in a controlled environment. The real test is whether it can handle the scale of the world's plastic waste." Charlie nodded, her heart still racing. But now it was a different kind of adrenaline. She knew this was coming. It wasn't enough to show Musk that her enzyme worked in a small experiment. She needed to prove that it could solve the global crisis of plastic pollution. She had already anticipated this challenge. "I've been testing it on different types of plastic, everything from bottles to bags to packaging. I've even been testing it on plastic waste from landfills, trying to replicate the real-world conditions." Musk raised an eyebrow. "And what about the cost? How much would it take to produce this on a global scale?" Charlie had already worked out a plan for the mass production of the enzyme, and she was ready to explain it. "We can produce it cheaply through a fermentation process. It's cost-effective and scalable, meaning it can be produced in large quantities without breaking the bank. And the more we produce, the cheaper it becomes." Musk seemed to consider this, but he wasn't easily convinced. It's one thing to produce a small amount, but what about the infrastructure? The logistics of getting it to every corner of the world? How will you ensure that it doesn't just get lost in the shuffle, like so many other great ideas? Charlie hadn't expected an easy ride. But the more Musk questioned her, the more she felt confident in her answers. She had thought about these problems for months, and while they were big, they weren't insurmountable. "We can start small, just like we did here. The process is scalable, and the key is to partner with companies already involved in waste management and recycling. If we can convince governments to subsidize the production, then we can make it affordable to deploy on a global level. This could be the start of a new, sustainable economy. We could even create jobs in the process, especially in regions struggling with waste management." Musk listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. "And what about the environmental impact? What's the long-term effect of deploying this enzyme in ecosystems?" Charlie had prepared for this question, too. The enzyme is completely biodegradable. It doesn't harm soil, water, or wildlife. And it's selective. It only targets plastic, not natural substances or living organisms. The enzyme breaks down into harmless byproducts after it does its job. Musk leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the surface of the table. "All right. You've convinced me that this could work. But now comes the hard part, turning this into a real solution. It's not enough to just have an invention. You need a system, a team, and the kind of global support that will make this happen." Charlie felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew that Musk wasn't handing her the keys to success just yet. He was a businessman and a visionary at that. He wanted to see the big picture. "I'm willing to help," Musk said finally, his voice steady. "I'll get my team at Tesla and SpaceX involved. We have the resources to scale this. But I need to see a full plan, a roadmap to bring this to life. And I need you to prove that you can handle this, that you're not just a young genius with an idea, but someone who can lead a movement." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. He's willing to help. "You've got a deal," she said, her voice full of determination. The week after her meeting with Elon Musk felt like a blur. Charlie was still processing everything that had happened. The success of her demonstration, the words of encouragement from Musk, and the huge responsibility now resting on her small shoulders. It was one thing to have an idea. It was another to have the world's attention. Musk had followed through on his promise. Within days of their meeting, Charlie's phone was flooded with emails, calls, and messages from some of the most powerful companies in the world. Tesla, SpaceX, and even some environmental organizations reached out, expressing their interest in her work. They wanted to collaborate, invest, and help scale her enzyme technology into something that could change the world. But even with all the excitement, Charlie knew that the real work was just beginning. Musk had given her a roadmap to success, but she had to walk it, and fast. As she sat in her room one night, staring at the pile of papers and contracts before her, Charlie realized that she was about to embark on a journey that would shape her entire life. The weight of it all was overwhelming, but she had never been more certain of her purpose. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Musk's team had already begun helping her assemble a team of scientists, engineers, and environmental specialists. They worked tirelessly, refining the enzyme, testing its capabilities in different environments, and scaling up production. Every test brought them one step closer to bringing Charlie's invention to the masses. But Charlie wasn't just sitting back, letting others do the work. She was deeply involved in every stage of the process, from overseeing lab tests to speaking with potential partners to strategizing how to roll out her enzyme on a global scale. She had never imagined her life would turn into this, a constant stream of meetings, calls, and presentations to government leaders, environmental activists, and business moguls. But she loved it. Every conversation, every step forward, made her feel like she was closer to achieving something monumental. One of the most exciting developments came when Musk invited her to visit Tesla's Gigafactory in Nevada. The factory, a massive complex dedicated to the production of electric vehicles and renewable energy solutions, was the perfect place to discuss how Charlie's enzyme could be produced on a global scale. Musk met her there in person, giving her a tour of the factory and introducing her to engineers and environmental experts. "This is where we can make it happen," he said as they stood in front of one of the assembly lines. "With Tesla's resources and SpaceX's logistics, we can deploy your enzyme technology at an unprecedented scale." Charlie's mind raced as she looked around. She had always dreamed of working in a place like this, but now it felt real. This wasn't just about solving a problem anymore. It was about creating an entire ecosystem around her discovery. And Musk was right. This could be the beginning of something huge. But there were challenges ahead. As Charlie worked with Musk's team, she began to realize how much she had to learn. The logistics of mass production, the partnerships needed with global waste management companies, the regulatory hurdles. These were the kinds of obstacles that she hadn't expected. Musk's influence helped smooth some of these issues, but there were still plenty of roadblocks ahead. One day, as Charlie was sitting in the lab reviewing data, her phone buzzed with an incoming video call. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered it anyway. The face that appeared on the screen was one she had seen many times before, her old mentor, Dr. James Bradley. "Charlie, how are you? I saw the news. You're making headlines everywhere." Dr. Bradley's voice was filled with excitement. "I'm doing well, Dr. Bradley. It's been crazy, but it's all coming together," Charlie replied, her smile growing. "I can't believe how fast everything is moving. Musk's team is incredible." "I've been following your progress," Dr. Bradley said, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You've got something big here, Charlie. The world is taking notice." Charlie's heart swelled with gratitude. Dr. Bradley had been there from the beginning, encouraging her and guiding her through every failure, every setback. It was his belief in her that had kept her going when she felt like giving up. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dr. Bradley," Charlie said sincerely. "You helped me shape this idea, and now we're on the verge of changing the world." Dr. Bradley smiled, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "Just remember, Charlie, this is a marathon, not a sprint. There are going to be challenges ahead, some that you haven't even thought about yet. But if anyone can navigate those challenges, it's you." Charlie nodded, knowing he was right. She had already seen how quickly things could change. Just as she had been catapulted into the global spotlight, the pressure and expectations were growing. There was no turning back now. She would have to stay focused, no matter how overwhelming it became. "I'll keep that in mind," Charlie said. "And thank you. I really appreciate everything you've done." Dr. Bradley gave her a thumbs up. "You've got this, Charlie. The world is lucky to have you." As the weeks turned into months, Charlie continued to work tirelessly, making headway on all fronts. She and Musk's team made significant progress on scaling up the enzyme's production. The first pilot plant was built, and early tests showed that the enzyme could be used to process massive amounts of plastic waste. Governments around the world were starting to take notice, with several countries beginning to show interest in funding the global deployment of the technology. But Charlie knew the hardest part was still ahead. The road to global impact was never easy, and there were still many hurdles to overcome: financial, political, and environmental. Every day, she faced the weight of knowing that one misstep could derail everything she had worked for. Yet, she never wavered. In every meeting, in every phone call, she felt the same sense of urgency she had felt when she first started. This was her mission, her responsibility. She wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was a leader, a beacon of hope in the fight against plastic pollution. And it was all coming down to one question: would the world stand with her? As the weeks turned into months, Charlie's life began to resemble a whirlwind. It wasn't just about the science anymore. It was about logistics, partnerships, negotiations, and navigating the complex world of global environmental policy. The stakes had risen, and the pressure was mounting with every passing day. But through it all, one thing was clear. Charlie was no longer just the young prodigy from a small town. She was a key player in the global battle against plastic pollution. The first major test of the technology came when Charlie and Musk's team presented the enzyme to the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, at their annual summit in Geneva. The world's environmental leaders, top scientists, government officials, and billion-dollar corporations all gathered to discuss the future of the planet. Charlie had been invited to speak, and she was both excited and terrified. Standing before a room full of people who had dedicated their lives to solving the world's environmental problems, Charlie took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. She was no longer the nervous girl from a small town. The weight of the moment had transformed her into a seasoned advocate for change. This was her chance to show the world what she and her team had been working on, and to finally prove that her invention wasn't just a fluke. The lights dimmed, and the audience grew silent. Charlie's voice filled the room as she began her presentation, describing the scope of the plastic pollution problem. She showed images of beaches covered in plastic waste, marine animals suffocating in plastic debris, and vast ocean gyres filled with non-biodegradable trash. "The statistics are staggering," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy inside her. "Every year, millions of tons of plastic waste enter our oceans, harming wildlife, polluting our waterways, and threatening ecosystems. Recycling programs are failing, and the plastic we use every day is piling up faster than we can handle it." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of the statistics settle in before moving on. "But there's hope. My team and I have developed an enzyme capable of breaking down plastic at an unprecedented rate. This enzyme can safely dissolve plastic into harmless byproducts, and the process is scalable. What we're offering today is not just an innovation, but a solution, a way to turn the tide against plastic pollution and give the planet a fighting chance." Charlie watched as the audience leaned forward, intrigued. The reactions were mixed. Some seemed captivated, others skeptical. She could feel the doubt hanging in the air. But there was no turning back now. She pressed forward, showing the results of the tests conducted over the past few months. Videos of the enzyme breaking down plastic bottles, packaging, and even microplastics played on the large screen behind her. Then came the crucial part, the pilot project. Charlie explained how they had successfully scaled up production of the enzyme at Tesla's Gigafactory in Nevada. They had already launched the first pilot program, testing it in several countries where plastic waste was a major issue: India, Indonesia, and Brazil. The results were promising, but Charlie knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Scaling this technology to handle the billions of tons of plastic waste produced every year required not just science, but global cooperation. After the presentation, Charlie was bombarded with questions. Some were congratulatory, others more critical. "How can we be sure this enzyme won't have unintended consequences?" one delegate asked. "What if it starts affecting natural ecosystems in ways we can't predict?" Charlie had expected this. "We've rigorously tested the enzyme in a variety of environments. It's biodegradable and only targets plastic. It won't harm soil, wildlife, or living organisms. But we are committed to ongoing research to ensure that it remains safe as we scale up." Another voice rose. "What about the cost? If this technology is going to be deployed worldwide, it has to be affordable for developing countries. How will you ensure that it's economically viable for everyone? That's where partnerships come in, Charlie responded confidently. With the support of global waste management companies, governments, and organizations, we can bring the cost down. The production process itself is inexpensive, and the more we scale it, the cheaper it becomes. This is about long-term sustainability, not just in terms of the environment but also in economic feasibility. A third question came from a corporate executive. What kind of global support are you expecting from private companies? The private sector has a role to play in this, too. Charlie smiled. Absolutely. I've already been in talks with companies like Tesla and other major environmental organizations. If we're going to make this work, we need the private sector to step up and invest in sustainable solutions. This is an opportunity for us all to make a real impact. The questions continued, but with each response, Charlie felt more confident. She wasn't just presenting an idea, she was presenting a movement, a new way of thinking about waste, sustainability, and the future of the planet. When the session ended, Charlie was exhausted but exhilarated. She had faced one of the toughest crowds in the world and had survived. The feedback was mostly positive, though she knew it would take time for the full impact of her invention to sink in. But something had shifted in the room. The skepticism was still there, but it was tempered with a sense of possibility. This wasn't just some pie-in-the-sky idea. This was a real solution, and people were starting to take notice. Elon Musk reached out to her after the presentation, congratulating her on the success. You did well, Charlie. But remember, this is just the beginning. Now we need to make it happen on a global scale. Charlie nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, it felt possible. Back home in the States, things were moving fast. Charlie's team was expanding, with more scientists, engineers, and environmentalists joining the effort. They were working around the clock to refine the enzyme and improve its performance in different conditions. The first global pilot project had already been launched in several countries, and the results were promising. Plastic was being broken down faster than ever before, and Charlie felt the weight of responsibility lift just a little. But not everyone was convinced. While most environmental groups and some governments supported the initiative, there were still powerful opponents. Major plastic manufacturers, for example, were wary of the impact this technology could have on their industry. Some argued that the enzyme would disrupt the existing recycling system, while others feared that it would lead to job losses in traditional waste management sectors. Charlie knew that the path forward wouldn't be easy, but she had something powerful on her side: the truth. Her invention wasn't just a breakthrough in science. It was a tool for change. And change, as everyone knew, wasn't always comfortable. A few weeks later, Charlie received an unexpected call. It was from the President of the United States. "We've been following your work closely, Miss Turner," the President said, his voice grave but encouraging. "Your enzyme could be the breakthrough we've all been waiting for. I'd like to meet with you to discuss how we can support your efforts on a national level." Charlie could hardly believe it. This wasn't just a meeting with a politician. It was an opportunity to change the course of history. She knew what this meant. If the U.S. government backed her invention, it would open the door for worldwide adoption. The next chapter of her journey was about to begin. The call from the President had shaken Charlie in ways she hadn't expected. Sitting in her apartment late that evening, she replayed the conversation in her mind. The weight of what it meant to have the full backing of the U.S. government was almost too much to process. This wasn't just an endorsement. It was a lifeline for her enzyme, a golden opportunity to change the entire trajectory of her work. If the government decided to support her technology on a national scale, it would be the catalyst for a global revolution in how the world dealt with plastic waste. But with that immense possibility came an even greater responsibility. Charlie wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was an agent of change, and that came with expectations that could crush her if she wasn't careful. The meeting with the President was scheduled for the following week in Washington, D.C. The news of the meeting spread quickly, and by the time Charlie arrived at the White House, her name had become a symbol of hope for millions of people concerned about plastic pollution. But Charlie was nervous. She wasn't prepared for the world of politics and international diplomacy. She had no experience navigating the corridors of power. As she walked through the grand halls of the White House, escorted by Secret Service agents, Charlie couldn't help but feel small, out of place. The walls seemed to close in on her, filled with portraits of historical figures and leaders whose decisions had shaped the world for centuries. Now, she was about to make a decision that could change the future of the planet. It was both humbling and terrifying. Elon Musk had accompanied her to the meeting. He had insisted that he join her, offering not only his technological expertise, but also his influence and credibility. After all, Musk had faced his share of opposition in the past, whether it was with electric cars, space travel, or solar energy. If there was anyone who understood the pressure of innovation, it was him. The door to the Oval Office opened, and Charlie was ushered in. President Caldwell, a seasoned politician with decades of experience, stood to greet her. He was an imposing figure, tall, with a sharp jawline and silver hair, but there was a warmth in his eyes as he shook her hand. "Miss Turner, Mr. Musk," President Caldwell said with a firm but welcoming tone. "I've heard so much about your work. It's an honor to meet you both." Charlie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was still processing the fact that she was standing in the room with the most powerful man in the world. She felt like an imposter, unsure whether she truly belonged there. "Thank you, Mr. President," Charlie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's an honor to be here." President Caldwell motioned for them to sit. The room was grand, but its beauty only heightened the gravity of the moment. Musk sat next to Charlie, his usual casual demeanor seemingly at odds with the formal setting. "I've been briefed on your work, Miss Turner," the president began, leaning forward in his chair. "What you've created could be a game-changer for the environment. Plastic pollution is one of the most pressing issues we face today, and it's only getting worse. But my question is, how do we make this work on a national scale? How do we take your discovery and turn it into action?" Charlie knew this question was coming. It was one thing to present a solution in the lab. It was another thing entirely to implement it across the country. She had spent months refining her plan, and now was the time to lay it all out. "Mr. President, the enzyme we've developed is scalable," she said confidently, despite the nervousness that still bubbled beneath the surface. "But we can't do it alone. We need support from both the government and private sector. To truly make an impact, we need to build a nationwide infrastructure for plastic waste management, one that incorporates this enzyme into the recycling process. That means partnering with local governments, private companies, and nonprofits to create an integrated system." President Caldwell nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, but we also need to consider the broader economic implications. Plastics are a multi-billion-dollar industry. How will we address the potential pushback from companies whose business models are built around plastic production?" Charlie had anticipated this. "We're not here to shut down industries. We're here to offer a solution. The plastic industry has been stuck in the same cycle for decades, but they're looking for ways to adapt. We need to work with them, not against them. My team and I are already in talks with major plastic manufacturers about how they can incorporate our enzyme into their recycling processes. And for the industries that rely on plastics, this could be a way to transition to more sustainable practices." Musk leaned forward, offering his perspective. "The tech world has gone through similar shifts. Look at electric cars. Tesla didn't go to war with traditional automakers. We showed them that the future is electric. The same can happen with plastic. We're offering a way for these companies to remain profitable while contributing to a cleaner future. It's not about fighting the industry. It's about transforming it." President Caldwell sat back, rubbing his chin in thought. "I see. And what about funding? This is going to take a lot of money to scale up. The infrastructure needed for something like this would be massive." Charlie's mind had been working on this for months. She had spoken with Musk's team about potential funding options, and now was the time to present them. "We have the backing of private investors," she said, "and we're already in discussions with organizations like the World Bank and the Green Climate Fund. With federal support, we can fast-track the development of the technology and infrastructure needed. The return on investment will come not just from environmental impact but from the creation of green jobs, reduced waste management costs, and potential new markets for sustainable materials." The president seemed to be weighing her words carefully. Charlie knew it was a delicate balance. On one hand, she had to present a compelling case for how this technology could be a profitable venture. On the other, she couldn't let the conversation devolve into a purely financial discussion. This was about the future of the planet. Finally, after a long pause, President Caldwell nodded slowly. This is a bold vision, Miss Turner. I'll be honest. We've seen a lot of bold ideas come and go, but I believe you're on the right track. We'll back you. We'll work with Congress to ensure the funding is there, and we'll help you build the partnerships you need to get this off the ground. Charlie couldn't believe it. The president was committing to it. She had done it. Musk grinned, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a look of pure satisfaction. That's what I like to hear. Charlie's mind raced as the implications of the president's words sank in. This wasn't just an endorsement. It was a commitment to real, lasting change. The next steps were going to be monumental, but with the government's backing, the world was now within her reach. As they left the Oval Office, Charlie couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The fight against plastic pollution had just entered a new phase, and she was leading the charge. The days following the meeting with President Caldwell felt like a blur. The news of the U.S. government's support for Charlie's plastic-eating enzyme spread like wildfire across media outlets worldwide. Headlines screamed, "A 9-year-old solution to plastic pollution gets U.S. government backing," and "the end of plastic waste?" One scientist may have just found the cure. Charlie had become the face of a new environmental movement. She wasn't just a young scientist anymore. She was a symbol of hope. Yet, as the media frenzy intensified, so did the pressure. The expectations were enormous, and with every interview, every photo op, Charlie felt the weight of the world grow heavier on her shoulders. She had always been driven by the idea of making a difference, but now, she was beginning to realize that her invention could either save the planet or fall short in ways she couldn't yet foresee. The first major hurdle arrived less than a month after the meeting with President Caldwell. Despite the political support, the world of corporate interest remained a battleground. Plastic manufacturers, many of whom had significant stakes in traditional plastic production and disposal, were pushing back. They had already begun lobbying against the enzyme, arguing that it would disrupt the existing recycling systems and, more importantly, their profits. Charlie and her team were prepared for the opposition, but nothing could have fully prepared them for the coordinated campaign against their work. Social media became a battleground, with posts from influential figures claiming the enzyme would cause irreparable damage to ecosystems, despite the extensive safety tests that had already been conducted. The skepticism wasn't just coming from large corporations anymore. It was spreading to the general public, fueled by misinformation and fear. One afternoon, while Charlie was going over a new data set in her office, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Musk. "Come to the lab. We need to talk." She immediately sensed something was off. Musk was usually calm and collected, but the tone of his message was urgent. A few minutes later, Charlie arrived at the lab, where Musk was pacing back and forth, his face serious. "We've got a problem," Musk said, not bothering with pleasantries. "The opposition is growing, and they're playing dirty." Charlie listened intently as Musk explained the situation. Several high-profile figures had come out publicly against her technology, citing concerns that the enzyme could have unknown side effects on ecosystems. Some were even claiming that it could lead to the collapse of natural food chains. The fear-mongering was relentless, and it was starting to gain traction. "They're spreading misinformation about the enzyme," Musk continued. "They're saying that it could accidentally break down organic material in the environment, not just plastic. And they've got a huge platform to spread that message." Charlie's stomach sank. She had anticipated pushback, but this was different. These weren't just concerns raised by a few isolated individuals. They were coming from powerful figures with deep pockets and far-reaching influence. "I've been thinking about this a lot," Musk said, his voice suddenly softer. "We need to address this, and fast. The public is starting to doubt your work. If we don't get ahead of this now, we could lose everything we've worked for." Charlie stood still, trying to absorb the magnitude of what Musk was saying. She had to act, and she had to act quickly. Her mind raced through possible solutions, but they all felt incomplete. What if the misinformation campaign succeeded? What if they couldn't convince the world that the enzyme was safe? "We can't afford to let this get out of control," Charlie said finally, her voice steady but filled with determination. "I'll speak to the public. I'll do whatever it takes to set the record straight." The next few days were a whirlwind of media appearances, press conferences, and emergency meetings with experts. Charlie knew she had to go on the offensive. She could no longer be just the quiet inventor. She needed to become the voice of her technology. If she didn't, the world might never get the chance to see what her enzyme could truly do. She took to social media, releasing a video explaining her enzyme in detail, addressing the misinformation head-on. She spoke about the rigorous safety protocols they had followed, the thousands of tests that had been conducted, and the research behind the enzyme's ability to break down plastic without affecting the natural environment. She also invited independent scientists to review their findings, ensuring transparency and credibility. The video quickly went viral. "This is about saving the planet," Charlie said in the video, her voice firm but compassionate. "This isn't just about one invention, it's about a solution. A solution to the plastic crisis we've been ignoring for far too long. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust the science." In the days that followed, the conversation began to shift. The media, once skeptical, started covering Charlie's enzyme more favorably. Independent scientists began publishing their own reviews of the data, confirming that the enzyme was safe and effective. The tide was turning, but Charlie knew it wasn't over. There were still powerful forces at play. A week later, Charlie and her team received an unexpected invitation. It was from the European Union. They wanted to meet to discuss how they could support her work in Europe and possibly integrate her enzyme into the EU's existing waste management and recycling systems. It was the kind of support that could change everything, but it came with its own set of challenges. The EU was notoriously cautious when it came to adopting new technologies, especially ones with environmental implications. Charlie boarded a plane to Brussels, her heart pounding. This was another crucial meeting. If she could convince the EU to back her enzyme, it would not only help the environment, it would solidify her place as a global leader in the fight against plastic pollution. Upon arriving in Brussels, she was whisked away to a conference room filled with European leaders, environmental experts, and scientists. The atmosphere was tense. The EU had been following her work closely, but the pushback from the plastics industry had caused many to question whether they should move forward with any kind of endorsement. After a brief introduction, Charlie stood up to give her presentation. She was more prepared than ever. With the data from the latest tests, the positive reviews from independent scientists, and the growing momentum in the media, Charlie was ready to make her case. "Plastic pollution is a global crisis," she began, her voice carrying the weight of the world. "We've been talking about it for decades, but talk is no longer enough. The enzyme I've developed can be the first real solution to this problem, not just in Europe, but across the globe. But to make that happen, we need you, the leaders of Europe, to support us. We need your backing to scale up, to build the infrastructure, and to help us make this solution available to every country that needs it." The room was quiet. The representatives exchanged looks, and Charlie could feel the tension in the air. Then, one by one, the questions began. And just like she had done before, she answered them with confidence, addressing concerns about the technology, the environmental impact, and the cost of implementation. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. The EU representatives were no longer questioning whether Charlie's enzyme could work. They were discussing how soon they could begin the process of integrating it into their waste management systems. Charlie left the meeting feeling a mix of relief and exhilaration. The EU had offered their support, and with that, her dream of global impact seemed closer than ever before. But she knew this was just another step on a long and uncertain journey. The global fight against plastic pollution was about to enter a new phase, and Charlie Turner was ready to lead it. The approval from the European Union was a massive victory, but it also raised the stakes. Now that Charlie's enzyme was gaining traction on a global scale, she found herself navigating uncharted waters: public perception, corporate resistance, and international collaboration. Every decision felt critical. It wasn't just about advancing science anymore. It was about the future of the planet and her place in its history. Back at the lab in San Francisco, Charlie had a small team working around the clock. They were refining the enzyme, optimizing its effectiveness in various environments, and testing how it could be scaled to industrial levels. It was exhilarating, but the pressure was suffocating. Charlie sat at her desk one evening, staring at the latest round of data from her team's tests. The enzyme was performing well, better than expected in some cases, but there were still kinks to work out. It was meant to degrade plastics in a controlled environment, but the world wasn't a controlled environment. Could it work in the oceans? Could it be effective on a global scale? Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was an email from Elon Musk. "Come to my office. We need to talk." Charlie frowned. It wasn't unusual for Musk to reach out, but there was an urgency in his message that caught her attention. She quickly gathered her things and drove to Tesla's headquarters, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Musk was already waiting in his office. He had that familiar, intense look in his eyes, the one that meant something big was happening. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. "I've just gotten off the phone with some key partners in Asia. They're ready to adopt your enzyme for use in the plastic recycling systems over there. But there's a catch." Charlie sat down across from him, already bracing for whatever news was coming. Asia's plastic waste problem is massive, but there's a lot of red tape involved. The local governments are interested in the technology, but the corporations there are pushing back even harder than they are here. They want to control the narrative, and they're not keen on your enzyme disrupting their profits. Charlie took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. This wasn't unexpected. She had known from the start that the road to global adoption would be filled with obstacles. But still, the weight of it all was overwhelming. "What's our next move?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Musk leaned forward, his hands clasped. "We need a plan to handle the opposition head-on. Not just here in the US or Europe, but across the globe. The corporate interests are well-funded, and they've got the kind of influence that can slow this down, maybe even stop it altogether. We need to figure out how to counteract that power." Charlie knew that Musk wasn't exaggerating. The global plastic industry was a multi-trillion-dollar business, and it wasn't going to roll over just because one 9-year-old's invention was threatening its business model. Charlie's invention had the potential to disrupt decades of profit, and that made it a target. "We're going to need more than just data and science," she said, thinking aloud. "We'll need a full public relations strategy, something that'll win people over to our side. We need to show that this is bigger than just a product. It's a movement." Musk smiled, the kind of grin that signified a new idea was brewing. "Exactly. You're not just a scientist anymore, Charlie. You're a symbol. People are listening to you, and the world is looking to you for a solution. But we need to amplify that message." Charlie nodded. She was beginning to understand. The future of her invention wasn't just in the laboratory. It was in the media, in public opinion, in every person who believed that this enzyme could be the answer to one of the world's biggest environmental crises. "I can help with that," Musk said, standing up. "I've got connections. Let's take this to the next level. But we need a game plan. Let's start with a global press conference. Bring in all the key players, scientists, environmental activists, politicians, and even some celebrities. Get the world talking." Charlie's heart raced. The idea of a press conference on a global scale was daunting, but she knew that the timing couldn't be better. If they played their cards right, this could be the defining moment that tipped the scales in her favor. "We'll do it," she said, her voice resolute. "But we need to make sure we have the facts, everything from environmental impact studies to financial projections. We need to have the evidence to back up our claims." Musk raised an eyebrow. "You've already got the evidence. What we need now is the story. And that's where you come in." Over the next few weeks, the team worked tirelessly to prepare for the global press conference. Charlie spent countless hours refining her talking points, rehearsing her presentation, and making sure every piece of data was solid. Meanwhile, Musk worked his connections in the media, securing interviews with major outlets and arranging for high-profile personalities to attend the event. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about solving a plastic crisis. It was about creating a movement that would unite the world behind a single cause. When the day of the press conference arrived, Charlie felt a mixture of excitement and fear. She was about to speak to a global audience of millions, and the pressure was overwhelming. But she couldn't back down now. The stakes were too high. The conference was held at a massive venue in New York City. As Charlie walked onto the stage, the bright lights and flashing cameras made her feel small, but she quickly steadied herself. This was her moment. The room was filled with journalists, environmental advocates, tech industry leaders, and even a few famous faces. Musk was standing off to the side, offering her a reassuring smile. Charlie stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and began. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are standing at a critical juncture in the history of our planet. Plastic pollution is one of the biggest challenges we face. And while we've talked about solutions for years, it's clear that what we've been doing isn't enough. That's why I'm here today, to tell you that we've found a real solution, a way to tackle the plastic crisis head-on. But we need to do it together. We need to act now. She paused, letting her words sink in. My team and I have developed an enzyme that can break down plastic in a matter of days, not years. This enzyme can change the way we manage waste, and it can revolutionize recycling on a global scale. But to do this, we need your help. We need your support. This is not just a scientific breakthrough. It's a movement to save our oceans, our wildlife, and our future. The crowd erupted into applause. Charlie smiled, but the real challenge had only just begun. As the press conference ended, Charlie felt a rush of emotions, relief, exhilaration, and a sense of determination. The world had heard her message, and now it was time to act. But in the back of her mind, one question lingered. Would this be enough to overcome the opposition? The battle for the future of plastic pollution was far from over. But Charlie Turner was no longer just a scientist, she was a leader. And she was ready to lead the world into a new era of sustainability. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The Global Press Conference was a resounding success, the kind of event that shifted the public conversation about plastic pollution in ways Charlie hadn't fully anticipated. It felt as though the world had collectively decided to take a deep breath and look toward a solution. The media blitz, the social media outpouring of support, and the celebrity endorsements all pointed to one thing. The world was watching. The world cared. But while Charlie basked in the glow of newfound hope, the reality of what lay ahead quickly became apparent. The corporations were not backing down. In fact, their pushback was intensifying. The media storm that had initially been so positive now began to churn with skepticism that was seeded by corporate giants eager to protect their interests. Charlie sat at her desk one afternoon, scrolling through a flood of news articles on her tablet. New enzyme promises to end plastic pollution. But is it safe? One headline read. Charlie Turner's plastic-breaking enzyme. A global solution or a dangerous gamble? Read another. The opposing articles weren't just in the corners of the internet anymore. They were everywhere. Mainstream media, tech blogs, even high-profile environmental groups questioning the long-term consequences of the enzyme. Her phone buzzed with another notification. This time it was a message from Elon Musk. We need to talk. It's time to take the fight to them. The next day, Charlie met Musk at the Tesla headquarters in Palo Alto. He was already in his usual spot, pacing in front of a large whiteboard, scribbling equations and ideas that made Charlie's head spin. It's getting worse, Charlie, Musk said, turning to her. They've started an all-out campaign against you. The plastics lobby is pulling every string they can. They're flooding social media, holding press conferences, getting their people on news shows. They're spreading lies, making it sound like your enzyme could cause a new environmental disaster. Charlie's stomach churned. She had known this was coming, but hearing it spelled out so plainly made it all the more real. She had imagined a battle of wits, of data and science, but she wasn't prepared for the level of manipulation that was unfolding before her eyes. We can't just play defense anymore. We need to take the fight to them, Musk continued. We've got the truth on our side, but we need to make sure people hear it. Charlie's eyes narrowed. What do you suggest? Musk smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. We need to go on the offensive. Get ahead of this. We need a counter-narrative, something that cuts through the noise. Over the next few weeks, Charlie and Musk worked tirelessly to create a counter-strategy. They began assembling a team of top-tier scientists, environmental experts, and media consultants to help them craft a message that would not only fight the misinformation but also counteract the fear that had been instilled in the public. Charlie would be the face of this new movement, the leader of the charge, but it wasn't going to be easy. The plan was simple but audacious. Charlie would embark on a global speaking tour, addressing world leaders, environmental conferences, and the public directly. She would use her story and her invention to highlight the dangers of inaction and to provide a clear, rational solution to the plastic crisis. At the same time, Musk would use his tech empire to mobilize support, pushing the message through SpaceX, Tesla, and Neuralink's networks. "We can't let them paint this as a battle of us versus them," Charlie said, as she and Musk mapped out their strategy. "We need to position this as a fight for the future of the planet. The plastic industry isn't the enemy. It's the status quo that we have to challenge." Musk nodded in agreement. "Exactly. People are scared, and when people are scared, they don't act. But if we show them what's at stake, if we show them the consequences of doing nothing, maybe then they'll join us." Charlie's first stop on the global tour was London, where she was invited to speak at the United Nations Global Environmental Summit. The room was filled with representatives from all over the world, from developing nations grappling with plastic pollution to large countries like China and India, whose consumption of plastic was staggering. Her speech was direct and impassioned, outlining the current state of plastic waste and laying out the facts about her enzyme. She didn't just talk about the science. She talked about the future, about the kind of world we could leave behind if nothing changed. She spoke with the kind of conviction that only comes from believing in something so deeply that nothing else matters. "It's not just about plastic," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "It's about our oceans, our wildlife, our children's future. We have a chance to end the cycle of plastic pollution, but we can't keep waiting. Every day we do nothing, more plastic ends up in the oceans. Every day we wait, more lives are lost to our indifference." The applause was overwhelming, but in the back of her mind, Charlie knew that the fight was far from won. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Charlie traveled from London to Paris, from Paris to Tokyo, and then to Nairobi, speaking at environmental conferences, meeting with world leaders, and engaging in grassroots activism. She was often met with applause, admiration, and enthusiasm from the general public. But there were those who still doubted her, who clung to the narrative that her enzyme was too risky, too untested. There were whispers of unintended consequences and irreversible harm. Every day, Charlie found herself fighting an invisible war, not just against the corporate powers that were trying to suppress her work, but against a growing wave of public fear. The more she spoke, the more she realized just how deeply ingrained the fear of the unknown was. The world was on the edge, ready for change, but terrified of the cost. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., the plastics industry was taking more drastic measures. Lobbyists were working overtime, trying to block funding for research into Charlie's enzyme. They were putting pressure on lawmakers, using their political influence to create roadblocks for any kind of large-scale adoption of the technology. The situation was becoming increasingly tense, and it wasn't just the business world that was resisting change. Some politicians were aligning themselves with the plastics lobby, playing up the supposed dangers of the enzyme to stoke public fear. In one of her most crucial meetings, Charlie sat down with President Caldwell once again, this time with Musk by her side. The tension in the room was palpable. "We've seen the reports," President Caldwell said, glancing at a folder of papers on his desk. "The plastics lobby is making some serious claims about your enzyme. They're saying it could do more harm than good. What can you tell me that will convince me this is a risk worth taking?" Charlie felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. This was the moment that could determine the future of her enzyme, of her mission, and of the planet. She took a deep breath and looked President Caldwell in the eye. "Mr. President," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I understand the fear. But fear cannot be the reason we let a crisis continue. What's truly risky is inaction. We have an opportunity to change the world, to make history. But we have to act now, before it's too late." The days after Charlie's meeting with President Caldwell felt like a blur. On one hand, the president had shown an open-mindedness that gave Charlie hope. He had listened, truly listened, and agreed to put the matter before Congress for further debate. But on the other hand, the plastics industry wasn't just sitting idly by. They were playing the long game, using every tool at their disposal to slow her down. And they weren't just using fear. They were using influence. As Charlie boarded her flight to Brazil for the next leg of her global tour, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from her legal team. The news was not good. "The U.S. Senate has fast-tracked a new bill," the lawyer said over the phone. It's called the Safe Plastics Act. If it passes, it will ban the commercial production and sale of your enzyme, at least in the US. They're framing it as a precautionary measure for public health and environmental protection. Charlie closed her eyes, her grip tightening on the armrest of her seat. This was it. The moment she feared had arrived. The moment when the full weight of the opposition came crashing down. "Do we have any time to fight it?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "Not much. The vote's set for next week. It's a tough battle. Too many senators have financial ties to the plastic industry." Charlie bit her lip, staring out of the window at the clouds. Every step of this journey had felt like walking on a tightrope. She had known it would be hard. She hadn't known it would be this brutal. Brazil was hosting an international environmental summit, and Charlie had been invited as one of the keynote speakers. The event was a massive deal, with scientists, policymakers, and climate activists from all corners of the globe in attendance. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, fine-tuning her speech and adjusting her arguments to the particular challenges of the Brazilian market, where plastic pollution was overwhelming their rivers and beaches. When she stepped onto the stage in São Paulo, the weight of the world seemed to lift off her shoulders, just for a moment. The applause was warm, and as she looked out over the crowd, she could see that there was still hope. People were here to listen, to learn, and to act. But even as she spoke about the urgency of the plastic crisis and the incredible promise of her enzyme, she couldn't escape the looming threat of what was happening back in the US. "There is no more time to waste," Charlie declared, her voice gaining strength as she moved through the speech. "The oceans are choking on plastic. Our wildlife is dying at unprecedented rates. And yet, we continue to wait, as if we have the luxury of time. My enzyme doesn't just break down plastic. It can rewrite the future of our planet. But for that to happen, we need to act now. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Now." The room erupted in applause, and for a moment, Charlie allowed herself to believe that this could be the turning point. But the reality quickly set back in. With each day, the momentum of opposition was building. She could almost hear the corporate voices in the distance, pressuring lawmakers and media outlets, flooding the internet with misinformation. Later that evening, Charlie attended a private dinner with environmental leaders. She felt a sense of camaraderie, of solidarity. These people were fighting the same fight, against deforestation, against pollution, against the climate crisis. The conversation was passionate and uplifting. But even here, Charlie felt the subtle sting of doubt creeping in. The bill in the US was on everyone's radar now. The pressure was mounting, and the public's appetite for change was waning. The next day, Charlie flew to Washington, D.C., for an emergency meeting with President Caldwell's team. Elon Musk was already there, waiting in the White House office, his usual calm demeanor now mixed with a palpable tension. "We don't have much time," Elon said as she walked into the room. "The Senate will vote tomorrow. If we lose, your enzyme could be banned before it even gets a chance to prove itself. We need a last-ditch effort." Charlie sat down, running a hand through her hair. This wasn't just a battle for her invention anymore. It was a battle for the future of the planet. And right now, it felt like they were losing. "We need to find a way to mobilize the public," she said, her voice low. "If we don't make it clear that this enzyme is the only viable solution to the plastic crisis, then the plastics industry will win. They have all the money, all the power." Elon nodded. "The media is already in their hands. But we've got something they don't: public support. People trust you, Charlie. They believe in you. We just need to give them a reason to act. We need a rallying cry." That night, Charlie didn't sleep. Instead, she and Musk worked through the night, drafting speeches, press releases, and social media campaigns. They called in favors, reaching out to activists, celebrities, and high-profile politicians who had voiced their support for her invention in the past. They worked relentlessly, building a global network of voices to back up the cause. By morning, they had a plan. It was risky, but it was their best shot. At the press conference the next day, Charlie stood before a room full of reporters, flanked by activists, scientists, and politicians. The stakes had never been higher. "I stand here today not just as a scientist, but as a citizen of this planet," Charlie began, her voice steady despite the anxiety swirling inside her. We are facing a crisis unlike any the world has seen. Plastic pollution is destroying our oceans, our ecosystems, and our health. But there is hope. There is a solution. She paused, letting her words sink in. Those who are fighting against this enzyme, against this solution, are not fighting for the environment. They are fighting to protect their profits. But we cannot afford to be passive any longer. The time to act is now. The room fell silent as the weight of her words hung in the air. We must protect our oceans. We must protect our children. We must protect the future. I ask all of you, whether you're a politician, a scientist, or an ordinary citizen, stand with me. Stand with us. Together, we can save this planet. The response was immediate. Social media erupted, with hashtags like #StandWithCharlie and #SaveOurOceans trending globally. News outlets picked up the story, with many questioning the integrity of the plastics industry's campaign against her. Activists marched on the steps of Capitol Hill, demanding that the Senate hear Charlie's plea. The pressure was mounting, and the plastics lobby could no longer ignore it. That afternoon, President Caldwell called Charlie. "I've seen the response," he said. "We're going to delay the vote. We need to hold hearings on this bill. You've made a compelling case, Charlie. It's time for us to make sure the people's voices are heard." For the first time in weeks, Charlie allowed herself to breathe. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had gained a critical reprieve. The tide was beginning to turn. As she sat down with Musk that night, Charlie felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "We're not done yet," she said, looking at him with determination. "But we're one step closer." And in that moment, Charlie Turner knew that the fight for the future of the planet had only just begun. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. Charlie had won a small victory by delaying the Senate vote, but she knew that the real battle had just begun. The plastics industry had not been defeated. They had only been delayed, and their resources were vast. The stakes had never been higher, and Charlie couldn't afford to lose momentum. The public had shown support, but she had to keep them engaged. She had to make sure the momentum didn't fade. The countdown to the vote was ticking down. Charlie found herself back in Washington, preparing for the public hearing that would be the next phase of the fight. It was a make-or-break moment. If she could convince Congress that her enzyme was the only viable solution to the plastic crisis, then the vote could go her way. But if she faltered, the plastics lobby would bury her under a mountain of misinformation. Elon Musk, as always, was by her side, offering his support in every way possible. He was behind the scenes, using his tech empire to rally his followers on social media, keeping the pressure on senators to make the right choice. But even Musk knew that no amount of technology or social media influence could change the facts. The real fight was going to be won or lost in that room. The hearing took place in a grand hall in the Capitol building. A long table was set up with witnesses and experts on one side, and senators on the other. Charlie sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her heart pounding in her chest. Musk was sitting in the back, surrounded by aides and a small group of tech investors who had thrown their weight behind her cause. Before her, the committee members sat in judgment. There were heavy hitters, senators with long records of voting for big business, for the status quo. There were also a few progressive voices who had championed environmental causes in the past. This was a courtroom, not for legal matters, but for the future of the planet. Senator Brockton, the chair of the committee, opened the hearing. He was a seasoned politician, known for his alliances with major corporations. His voice was low and measured, and he wasted no time in getting to the point. "Ms. Turner, we're all aware of the impact that plastic pollution has had on our environment," Brockton began, his eyes fixed on her. "But the question we have to ask is whether your enzyme is a viable solution. We've heard concerns from various experts about its long-term effects. Are we sure that this enzyme is safe? And how do we ensure that it doesn't cause more harm than good?" Charlie took a deep breath, meeting Brockton's gaze with calm determination. "Senator, I understand the concerns, but the real danger lies in doing nothing. The status quo, the continued production and disposal of plastics, is what's causing the irreparable damage to our oceans, our wildlife, and our health. My enzyme is the solution we've been waiting for. It's safe, it's effective, and it's already been proven in multiple trials to break down plastics into harmless components. There is no viable alternative. Brockton's eyes narrowed. But what about the potential risks? There's a reason the plastics industry has raised alarms. We don't know the full scope of what might happen if we unleash this enzyme on a global scale. What happens if it spreads uncontrollably? What happens if we create a new environmental disaster? Charlie had anticipated this question. She leaned forward, her voice steady but impassioned. The risks of doing nothing far outweigh the potential risks of this enzyme. We are already living in an environmental disaster. Our oceans are suffocating on plastic. If we don't act now, we will reach a point of no return. This enzyme could help reverse the damage that has already been done. We've conducted multiple safety tests, and everything shows that it's not only effective, it's safe. For hours, the committee grilled Charlie with technical questions about the enzyme's chemical properties, its environmental impact, and its scalability. Each time, Charlie answered with facts, backed by research and data. She had prepared for this moment her whole life. And yet, as the hours passed, she could feel the weight of the room. The plastics lobby was fighting back, and they were using every tool at their disposal. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice broke into the debate. "Senator Brockton, if I may." The voice was calm but firm. Charlie turned to see Senator Elisa Ramirez, one of the few environmental advocates on the committee. Ramirez was known for her progressive views and her staunch defense of environmental issues. She had supported Charlie's efforts from the beginning, and she had always been a thorn in the side of corporate interests. "What we're witnessing here today," Senator Ramirez continued, "is the same old argument that we've seen time and time again. The fear of change, the fear of innovation. But let's be clear about something. This is not about science. This is about protecting profits." The room fell silent. Charlie looked at Ramirez, feeling a surge of hope. Ramirez went on. "We all know the plastics industry has deep pockets. We know they fund lobbying efforts, they fund studies designed to scare the public, and they spend millions trying to suppress new ideas. But at some point, we have to decide. Do we continue to let the planet burn while we prop up industries that only care about their bottom lines? Or do we embrace the future?" The room buzzed with murmurs, some supportive, others skeptical. But it was clear that Ramirez's words had struck a chord. Charlie felt her resolve strengthen. The hearing dragged on for hours, but eventually, it was time for closing statements. Charlie stood, her legs a little shaky but her voice strong. She looked out over the room, meeting the eyes of the senators, many of whom would decide the fate of her invention. "I understand the concerns," she began, "and I don't take the responsibility lightly. This enzyme has the potential to change everything. But it will only work if we choose to act. If we choose to take a leap into the future, where innovation can save us, rather than lock us into the past. The choice is ours. And I'm asking you, as leaders of this country, to make the right one. For the planet, for our children, and for future generations." As she finished, she felt the eyes of the room on her. The tension was palpable. She had done all she could. Now, it was in their hands. Back in the White House, President Caldwell watched the hearing from his office. His advisors were gathered around him, offering their analysis. The vote was coming soon, and the pressure was mounting. There were still senators on the fence, still those who hadn't made up their minds. But one thing was clear. Charlie had given them something to think about. She had given them hope. "Let's make sure we're ready," Caldwell said, turning to his team. "The people are with her. It's time to make history." As Charlie left the hearing room, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. But she also felt something else, something that had been missing for a long time. It was a spark of hope. She had fought with everything she had, and now it was out of her hands. All she could do was wait. But as she walked out into the corridor, her phone buzzed again. It was an urgent message from Musk. "The vote is tomorrow. We're not done yet, Charlie. We need one final push." The following day was one of the longest of Charlie's life. The Senate vote was fast approaching, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. It wasn't just the future of her enzyme at stake. It was the future of the planet. Every hour felt like a year as she paced the hallways of the Capitol building, checking her phone obsessively, waiting for any sign that the tide was turning in her favor. Elon Musk had told her they weren't done yet, and he was right. The plastics industry was pulling every trick in the book, doubling down on misinformation, using their massive media platforms to cast doubt on her enzyme. They'd even gone so far as to manipulate public opinion by airing commercials that painted Charlie as a reckless scientist whose invention could unleash unknown consequences. But there was something Elon had said that stuck with her. The truth is your weapon, Charlie, and the people are with you. We just need to remind them of that one last time. The final push. Charlie's team had mobilized like never before. The social media campaign had reached a fever pitch, with celebrities, influencers, and environmental activists posting videos and statements in support of her work. The hashtags #SaveOurOceans and #StandWithCharlie had gone viral, flooding every major platform. People from all over the world had rallied behind her cause, with millions of petitions signed, emails sent to senators, and protests organized outside Capitol Hill. But even with all this, Charlie knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed to go to the people directly, to speak to them, to remind them what they were fighting for. The plan was set. Charlie would deliver one final speech, an impromptu broadcast that would air across multiple networks, streamed live to millions of viewers. It wasn't part of the original schedule, but it was the only way to give one last, impassioned plea to the public before the vote. The moment was fast approaching, and there was no room for hesitation. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the Capitol, Charlie stood in front of the cameras in a small media studio, her nerves building with each passing second. Elon, sitting in the back of the room, gave her an encouraging nod. She had been through worse. This was just another stage. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the center of the stage. The lights dimmed, and the cameras focused on her, capturing the intensity of the moment. "Good evening," Charlie began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Charlie Turner. I'm a scientist, an inventor, and, like many of you, I'm a person who cares deeply about the future of our planet." She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. For years, we've watched as plastic has taken over our oceans, suffocating marine life, poisoning our environment, and threatening the very systems that sustain life on Earth. We've known about this problem for decades, yet we've continued to ignore it. And now, the time for action is running out. She paused again, her eyes scanning the camera, as though speaking directly to each viewer watching at home. But there's hope. There's a solution. A way to undo some of the damage we've done. My enzyme, this tiny, groundbreaking molecule, can break down plastics in a way that nothing else can. It's a tool, not just for the present, but for the future. It's safe. It's effective. And most importantly, it works. The camera zoomed in on her face, her passion evident in every word. "I'm asking you, the people of this world, to stand with me. Stand with us. We are at a crossroads. We can choose to listen to the fearmongers who want to protect their profits, or we can choose to embrace the future and protect our children, our oceans, and our planet." Her voice wavered slightly, but she quickly regained control. "I'm asking you to make your voice heard. Call your senators. Write to your representatives. Demand that they vote for the future. Demand that they support this enzyme, this solution. The fight isn't just mine. It's ours. It's all of us." The silence in the room was palpable as she finished, every word hanging in the air. "If we fail," she continued softly, "then we're choosing to let our children inherit a world that's beyond repair. But if we succeed, we can leave them a world that's worth living in. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can save this planet." As the broadcast ended, the studio lights came back up. Charlie felt a surge of exhaustion, but also a strange sense of peace. She had done everything she could. Now, the rest was out of her hands. All she could do was wait. The next few hours were a blur. Social media exploded with responses, the speech spreading like wildfire. Support for her invention surged as millions of people took to the streets, rallying in her support. Celebrities shared her speech, politicians chimed in with their endorsement, and even people who had been skeptical began to rethink their positions. But then came the phone call she had been dreading. It was from her legal team. The vote was only hours away, and the plastics lobby had pulled out all the stops. A last-minute smear campaign had started airing nationwide. They were attacking her personally now, not just her invention. Her character, her motives, her credibility, all were under assault. The smear ads were relentless, painting her as a mad scientist driven by greed rather than a savior for the planet. Charlie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the world pressing in on her. The fear was palpable, but deep down, she knew this was the moment. This was the final test. It wasn't about the truth anymore. It was about who had the loudest voice. It was the morning of the vote, and Charlie stood in front of the Senate chamber, surrounded by her team. The hallways were filled with tension. Every conversation seemed to be about the vote, and the weight of every step felt heavier than the last. Charlie glanced over to see Elon, who had been a silent force throughout this ordeal, standing by her side. He offered a brief, reassuring smile. He knew better than anyone how this kind of battle could change the course of history. The Senate floor was packed. Senators milled around in groups, discussing the impending vote. Charlie could feel her heart racing, but she reminded herself that this was it. She had done everything she could. The bell rang, signaling the start of the vote. Senator Brockton took to the podium to call for order. He was the one who had seemed the most skeptical throughout the hearings. As he began speaking, the room fell silent. "Today, we vote on the future of this nation," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "We vote on whether to allow a potentially dangerous enzyme to be unleashed upon the world. We vote on whether to choose innovation or risk." Charlie held her breath as the roll call began. And then came the moment she would remember for the rest of her life. The vote was tallied. It was close, very close. The room erupted into applause. Charlie stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just happened. She had won. Against all odds, against a billion-dollar industry, against the full weight of misinformation and fear, she had won. As she looked over at Elon, his face broke into a wide grin. "You did it, Charlie," he said quietly. "We did it." Charlie looked out over the room, feeling the tears sting her eyes. She had fought for the future, and the future had just become a little brighter. The day after the Senate vote, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The news outlets, from global broadcasters to local papers, were flooded with headlines about Charlie Turner's victory. "Breakthrough enzyme approved, a game-changer for plastic pollution," one headline read. Another exclaimed, "Senate votes to end plastic crisis. Charlie Turner's invention wins the battle." It felt surreal. Charlie had spent years, even decades, in the shadows of scientific research, unnoticed and unappreciated. Now, she was at the center of a global movement. But despite the whirlwind of media attention, she remained grounded, focused on the task ahead. The battle was far from over. She sat at a conference table in her office, surrounded by her team. Elon Musk, with his usual casual demeanor, leaned back in his chair, a proud smile on his face. "I told you this was just the beginning," he said, his voice calm but full of satisfaction. "Now, we have to get this enzyme into the right hands." Charlie nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. The approval was monumental, but the real challenge was just beginning. Scaling up production, getting the enzyme into industrial use, overcoming the challenges of global distribution. She knew the road ahead would be just as difficult as the one she had just walked. But this time, the world was watching, and she had the momentum on her side. In the days following the vote, Charlie's phone rang off the hook. Heads of state, environmental organizations, tech companies, and even private investors wanted a piece of her success. Offers of support, of partnerships, flooded in. Charlie was amazed at how quickly things were moving, but she couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, and she didn't know who to trust. The plastics industry, still reeling from the loss, had not given up. She could feel their watchful eyes on her every move. Elon, ever the strategist, had already begun making plans. He was in constant contact with his network of business leaders, trying to figure out how they could ramp up production. They needed to move quickly, every moment counted. The plastics industry was vast, and despite the political victory, the battle for the planet was still a long way from one. "I think we should start with small-scale production," Elon suggested, his voice matter of fact. get it right, test it in the real world. Then, we scale up. We need a global operation, not just a local one. Charlie considered this. The logistics alone will be a nightmare. We need partners, companies that can help us distribute it on a massive scale. But we can't just hand it over to anyone. We need companies that share our values, that care about the environment as much as we do. The next few months were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and strategy sessions. Charlie had become a fixture in boardrooms and governmental offices. But despite all the progress, there was an underlying tension in the air. Everyone wanted a piece of the success, but very few wanted to take on the true responsibility of making the world better. The corporate world was still dominated by profit motives, and while many companies were interested in adopting Charlie's enzyme, it was clear that their commitment to the planet was often secondary to their bottom line. Then, just as the first trials began to show success, disaster struck. It started with a call from one of Charlie's key partners, Aquatech, a water treatment company that had been working with Charlie to integrate her enzyme into large-scale plastic waste processing facilities. The company had been making strides, but something had gone terribly wrong. Their first pilot project, which was supposed to use the enzyme to break down plastic waste in an offshore processing plant, had gone off the rails. The enzyme had started to work faster than expected, far faster. Within days, Aquatech reported that the enzyme had begun breaking down not just plastic, but other materials, including certain metals, fabrics, and even building materials. The rapid reaction had caused unexpected chemical reactions in the plant systems, throwing the entire operation into chaos. Charlie's heart sank as she listened to the details. There were no reports of injuries, but the financial damage was already significant. This wasn't just a failure. It was a catastrophic problem that could have long-term effects on the enzyme's reputation. If the enzyme was too unpredictable, it could set back everything they had worked for. And the media, ever hungry for a story, would seize on any potential flaw. Charlie, Elon, and their team moved quickly to assess the damage. The first priority was ensuring that the enzyme's reaction could be contained and that no further damage occurred. Scientists worked around the clock to analyze the enzyme's properties and figure out why it had acted so aggressively in this case. After several sleepless nights, Charlie and her team discovered that the enzyme had, in fact, been effective, but too effective. It had broken down plastic and other materials so rapidly that it had triggered a chain reaction in the environment around it, much like how certain chemicals in nature interact when introduced to a new element. They had miscalculated the enzyme's potential and how it would interact with other substances outside the lab. But this wasn't an unsolvable problem. Charlie realized that they could introduce an inhibitor into the enzyme formula, one that would control its reaction rate, making it far more manageable. It would require months of testing and tweaking, but it was possible, and they would do it. "We'll fix it," Charlie said, determination flooding her voice. "We'll make it safe again." Despite the setback, there was no turning back now. The world was watching, and Charlie was more committed than ever. She poured herself into the project, working with the team day and night to perfect the formula. Meanwhile, Elon kept the pressure on from the business side, ensuring that investors remained confident in the long-term potential of the enzyme. As the weeks passed, the revised formula was ready for testing. The inhibitors had worked, and the enzyme now operated in a far more controlled manner. There was still work to be done, but Charlie and her team were confident they could roll out the new version of the enzyme soon. In the meantime, Charlie's message continued to spread. The environmental movement had gained unprecedented momentum, with millions rallying behind her cause. The media, though critical of the setback, still recognized the potential of the enzyme to change the world. The world was hungry for a solution to the plastic crisis, and Charlie had provided that solution, despite the hurdles. And then, just as the new trials began to show promise, Charlie received another unexpected call, this time from President Caldwell himself. "Charlie, I just wanted to personally congratulate you on your success," the president said. "The Senate's vote was historic, and I'm proud of the leadership you've shown in pushing this through. But I also wanted to ask, what's next? What's the next big step for you, for us, for the planet?" Charlie paused, thinking for a moment. "Mr. President, it's not over yet. We've made great strides, but there's still work to be done. The world has finally woken up to the crisis we're facing, but we need to keep pushing, keep innovating. We need global cooperation, massive investment in cleanup efforts, and continued technological breakthroughs. The president's voice was filled with resolve. I agree, and will support you every step of the way. This isn't just a scientific breakthrough, it's a movement. And I want you to know that you have the full backing of my administration. As Charlie hung up the phone, she felt a wave of relief. For the first time in months, the future didn't seem as uncertain. She had the world's attention, and she had the support of those who could make real change. But most importantly, she had the belief that together, they could rewrite the future of the planet. The days turned into weeks, and as Charlie's enzyme began its next phase of trials, she couldn't help but think back to the moment when everything had started, the moment she discovered the potential for this enzyme to save the planet. She had come a long way since then, through every twist and turn, but now, she was closer than ever to making her vision a reality. The world was watching. The fight was far from over, but Charlie Turner had become a symbol of hope for the planet's future. And with the world united behind her, the sky was the limit. The months following Charlie's victory were nothing short of revolutionary. The global response to her enzyme was overwhelming. On one hand, it was a whirlwind of support, while on the other, it was a chaotic storm of opposition. The plastics industry, bruised by its failure in the Senate, had gone into damage control, pushing back hard against the enzyme's potential. But despite their efforts, the tide was clearly shifting in Charlie's favor. By the time the revised version of the enzyme was ready for full-scale trials, international governments were beginning to take action. Countries around the world were reaching out to collaborate with Charlie and her team, eager to jumpstart large-scale plastic waste remediation projects. Environmental groups, from grassroots organizations to global leaders like Greenpeace and the World Wildlife Fund, were organizing massive campaigns to support the enzyme's adoption. And yet, there was an undercurrent of tension. Not everyone was on board, and Charlie knew that even her victory in the Senate was just the beginning of a much larger battle. She'd won the war in the political arena, but the real test lay in winning the global fight against plastic pollution. The United Nations had scheduled an emergency summit, and Charlie had been invited to speak. The event, held in Geneva, was broadcast live across the globe. World leaders, scientists, and environmental activists were all gathered under one roof, their eyes focused on the same singular goal, the future of the planet. Charlie sat in the green room, waiting for her turn to speak. Her nerves were on edge. This was bigger than anything she had ever done. Not just the media presence, not just the international audience, but the sheer gravity of what was at stake. She was about to address some of the most powerful people on Earth. If she didn't convince them to act, who would? "Charlie, you're up next," said a voice from the doorway. Elon, who had accompanied her to the summit, gave her a supportive smile. "You've got this. Just remember, it's not just about the enzyme. It's about the future." Charlie nodded. She appreciated his confidence, but she couldn't shake the weight of the moment. When her turn came, she stepped out onto the stage, the spotlight blinding her for a moment as she faced the world's most influential leaders. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, but she took a deep breath and began. "Good morning," Charlie said, her voice steady. "My name is Charlie Turner, and I'm here to talk about the most pressing issue facing our planet today, plastic pollution." She paused for a moment, taking in the faces of world leaders who sat before her, some nodding in agreement, others watching with skepticism. The eyes of the world were upon her, and the pressure was immense. "I've spent my entire career researching ways to address this crisis. As you know, the amount of plastic in our oceans has reached catastrophic levels. We're suffocating the life that our oceans sustain, poisoning our ecosystems, and creating a future where our children may not know a world free from plastic waste." Charlie's voice caught, but she quickly regained control. "I developed an enzyme, a solution that can break down plastic at a molecular level. And after years of research, the enzyme is ready for global application. But here's the thing. It's not just about the enzyme. It's about all of us working together to turn the tide. This is not a single scientist's battle. It's a global one." The room was silent, save for the occasional rustling of papers. Charlie could feel the weight of the moment, but she pushed on. "We cannot afford to wait. Every year, we add millions of tons of plastic to our oceans. We know that for every piece of plastic we remove, we are saving countless marine species, ensuring that future generations can inherit a planet that is not suffocated by our waste. She looked directly at the leaders in the room. Today, I am asking you, not as a scientist, but as a mother, a daughter, a global citizen, to make a commitment. A commitment to fight plastic pollution. A commitment to implement this technology and partner with innovators, environmentalists, and businesses across the globe to make this change happen. There was a pause, the weight of her words hanging in the air. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the room erupted in applause. The summit was a turning point. By the end of the conference, 14 nations had committed to launching large-scale trials of Charlie's enzyme in their plastic waste processing plants. The United States, Canada, the European Union, and several countries in Asia and Africa were all on board. For the first time in decades, it felt as though the global community had found a unifying cause. There was hope. Charlie, exhausted but exhilarated, walked off the stage with Elon by her side. He clapped her on the back, beaming. "You did it, Charlie. You just changed the world." She smiled, but there was a shadow in her eyes. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, and she knew better than anyone that no victory came without sacrifice. But for the first time, she felt that they were truly making a dent in the global plastic crisis. Despite the momentum, Charlie's victory wasn't without its obstacles. The plastics industry, reeling from its political defeat and the sudden shift in public opinion, wasn't ready to go down quietly. In fact, they were preparing for an all-out counteroffensive. It started with a new round of media campaigns, this time aimed at discrediting the enzyme on a technical level. Industry experts, funded by the Plastics Coalition, began questioning the enzyme's scalability and long-term effectiveness. They published reports claiming that while the enzyme was effective in breaking down certain types of plastic, it wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Some plastics, they argued, might prove resistant to the enzyme's effects. Others suggested that the rapid degradation of plastic could lead to unintended environmental consequences, such as the release of toxic byproducts. Charlie knew these claims were exaggerated. She had always said that the enzyme was a tool, not a silver bullet. But the smear campaigns had begun to sway public opinion. Media outlets that had once championed her invention now started to give more airtime to the detractors. Investors began to grow cautious, unsure of the long-term stability of the enzyme market. One evening, as Charlie sat in her office, reviewing the latest reports and press clippings, she received an unexpected call. It was from Senator Brockton, the same senator who had been one of the fiercest opponents of her enzyme in the Senate. "Dr. Turner," he said, his voice cold but measured, "I think it's time we have a conversation." Charlie leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. The phone call with Senator Brockton was unexpected, but she couldn't ignore it. She had known from the moment the Senate vote passed that the battle wasn't over. The plastics industry, backed by powerful political forces, would strike back, and they were already regrouping. "Dr. Turner," Brockton's voice crackled from the other end of the line, "I'm sure you're aware of the growing concerns surrounding your enzyme. You've made quite a stir. And now, people are starting to question whether it's really the panacea you've claimed it to be." Charlie's heart sank. "I never said it was a panacea. The enzyme is part of a solution, one piece of a much larger puzzle. We still need policy changes, investment in recycling infrastructure, and public awareness campaigns. This is a global issue, Senator." There was a pause on the other end. Brockton had a way of speaking that made everything sound calculated, as though he were always 5 steps ahead in a game he'd invented himself. "I agree, Dr. Turner. But the reality is, your enzyme has shaken things up in a way that wasn't expected. People are questioning the long-term effects. You've seen the reports, I'm sure, the environmental side effects, the scalability issues, the potential economic impacts. You need to think about how to address these concerns head-on before they spiral out of control." Charlie could feel the thinly veiled threat in his words. Brockton wasn't just concerned with the science. He was concerned with the economic interests of his constituents. The plastics industry was a giant, and it wasn't going down without a fight. "I'm well aware of the concerns, Senator. That's why we've already begun implementing rigorous testing and controls. We're doing everything we can to ensure this enzyme is safe and effective at scale. But I won't apologize for trying to save the planet. Another silence stretched between them. Finally, Brockton spoke again, his tone shifting ever so slightly. I'm not asking for an apology, Dr. Turner. I'm asking for a partnership. The meeting with Senator Brockton was a turning point. Over the next few days, Charlie weighed his offer, a partnership between her and the plastics industry, to work together to refine the enzyme and address the concerns being raised. On one hand, it could provide her with the resources she needed to scale up the project and counter the growing backlash. On the other, it felt like a dangerous compromise, aligning herself with the very industry that had fought her every step of the way. But as the days passed, Charlie realized that she didn't have many options. The growing resistance was too strong, and the fear-mongering around her enzyme was starting to gain traction. The plastics industry was a machine with vast resources, and trying to take it down entirely without their support could mean failure for her efforts. Elon Musk, as usual, was pragmatic about the whole situation. You can't win a war without understanding the enemy, he said, when Charlie shared her concerns. You need their resources, their network, and their manufacturing capabilities. If you can work with them, not against them, you'll be able to scale this thing. But don't let them control the narrative. Keep your eyes on the prize, cleaning the planet. Charlie was torn, but she knew that if she didn't act, she could lose everything. She agreed to the meeting, arranging a negotiation with Senator Brockton and a delegation from the Plastics Coalition. The meeting took place in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in Washington, D.C. The room was a far cry from the dusty labs Charlie was used to. She sat at the table, facing Brockton and a group of top executives from the plastics industry. They were dressed in perfectly tailored suits, their faces set in expressions that radiated power. Charlie, on the other hand, was more casually dressed, her sleeves rolled up and her expression a mixture of determination and cautious optimism. Dr. Turner, Brockton began, we've all heard the claims about your enzyme, and we're not here to dismiss it, but the fact remains that it's untested at scale. It's one thing to break down plastic in a lab. It's another thing entirely to do it on an industrial level without causing unforeseen consequences. Charlie nodded, ready to address the elephant in the room. I'm aware of the concerns, Senator. That's why we've already initiated a second phase of testing, one that includes extensive real-world trials. We're working with environmental scientists, manufacturers, and government agencies to ensure that the enzyme is safe, scalable, and effective. Brockton's gaze didn't soften. And that's all well and good, Dr. Turner. But the truth is, the world isn't going to buy into your enzyme unless we address the bigger picture. People want assurances. They want to know that this won't cause environmental disasters down the road. That's where we come in. Charlie's heart beat faster. And what exactly are you proposing? One of the executives from the Plastics Coalition spoke up, his voice smooth and confident. We're willing to help fund the research and development of your enzyme, under one condition. We need control over the distribution and the intellectual property. We'll also need to collaborate on a marketing campaign to ensure that the public perceives this as a solution they can trust. The words hit Charlie like a punch to the gut. Control? Intellectual property? Marketing campaigns? These were the very forces she had been fighting against. The idea of handing over control to a profit-driven industry felt like a betrayal. But the stakes were high. Without their funding and resources, she might not be able to continue her work. The world needed this solution, and the plastics industry had the infrastructure to make it happen. She glanced at Elon, who was sitting quietly across from her, watching her every move. He didn't need to speak. His eyes told her everything she needed to know. It was time to make a deal on her terms. Charlie sat up straighter. I agree that funding and collaboration are essential. But let me be clear. I will not hand over the intellectual property of this enzyme. Not to anyone. If you want to work with us, it will be as partners, not as owners. Brockton raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting her to push back so strongly. Dr. Turner, you must understand the stakes here. We're talking about the future of an entire industry. We're talking about billions of dollars in investment, and we need to ensure that we protect that investment. I understand the stakes, Charlie replied, her voice steady. But I also understand that I've spent years developing this solution. This enzyme isn't just a product, it's a lifeline for the planet. I won't compromise that for the sake of profit. If you want to help, we can partner on distribution and testing, but I will retain full ownership of this technology. There was a long silence, the tension thick in the air. Charlie held her ground, refusing to back down. Finally, Brockton leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. You drive a hard bargain, Dr. Turner, but we're willing to negotiate. We'll help fund the next phase of your research and distribution efforts, but we'll need an exclusive license to distribute the enzyme for a set period of time. That gives us a chance to prove its viability in the market, and in return, we'll cover your R&D costs. Charlie exhaled slowly. It wasn't the perfect deal she had envisioned, but it was a compromise. And more importantly, it gave her the resources she needed to move forward. She nodded, extending her hand across the table. Deal. But I want a seat at the table when it comes to policy changes. We're not just developing a product. We're solving a global crisis. In the weeks that followed, Charlie's partnership with the Plastics Coalition and Senator Brockton became public knowledge. The media reacted with a mixture of skepticism and approval. Some hailed it as a pragmatic step forward. Others feared it was the beginning of a dangerous alliance between profit-driven forces and environmentalists. But Charlie, ever the realist, focused on the task at hand. The enzyme was moving forward. Scaling up production was a monumental task, but with the funding and resources she had secured, the future seemed brighter than ever. And then, just as the dust began to settle, a new development arrived that no one had anticipated. Charlie was sitting in her lab, reviewing the latest data from the enzyme trials when her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen. It was an email from the United Nations Environmental Committee, marked urgent. Her stomach tightened as she clicked open the message. Subject, urgent, immediate action required, enzyme in the field. Dear Dr. Turner, we have received alarming reports about the enzyme's application in real-world environments. The trials conducted in several countries, including Canada, the UK, and India, have shown unexpected results. While the enzyme effectively breaks down plastics, some ecosystems are showing signs of imbalance. We are urgently requesting a meeting to discuss these findings and consider halting its deployment until further studies are conducted. Please confirm your availability for an emergency session tomorrow at 10 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Sincerely, Global Environmental Oversight Board. Charlie's heart raced. She knew the enzyme was still in the early stages of widespread testing, but she hadn't expected this. Ecosystem imbalances? The implications of such findings could undo everything she had worked for. She immediately fired off a quick reply to the board, agreeing to attend the session. As she sat there, trying to process the email, Elon walked into the lab, holding a coffee cup in one hand. He raised an eyebrow as he saw the look on her face. What's going on? Charlie handed him her phone, her fingers trembling. Elon read the email quickly and looked up, his face serious. This isn't good, he said softly. Are you sure this is accurate? Charlie nodded. The trials were supposed to be straightforward. The enzyme was supposed to break down plastic, not disrupt ecosystems. But now we've got data suggesting that it's affecting soil quality, altering water pH, and in some cases, harming local biodiversity. Elon sat down beside her. You need to find out exactly what's happening before it blows up in the media. This could derail everything. Charlie knew he was right. The media was already on high alert, ready to pounce on any potential failure. She needed to act fast, to understand what was going wrong, and, more importantly, how to fix it before it spiraled out of control. The emergency session with the United Nations Environmental Committee was set to take place the following day. Charlie and Elon flew to Geneva that night, nerves fraying with each passing hour. On the plane, Elon was unusually quiet, staring out the window as the city lights below twinkled in the darkness. Do you think this can be fixed? Charlie asked, breaking the silence. She leaned her head against the window, exhaustion creeping into her bones. Elon turned to her, his expression soft but determined. It has to be, Charlie. If anyone can find a solution, it's you. You've come this far. Don't let this setback take you down. She nodded, though doubt still lingered in the back of her mind. The stakes had never been higher. She was fighting not just for her enzyme, but for the future of the planet. The following morning, Charlie stood in a grand conference room at the United Nations headquarters. Around her were representatives from over 30 countries, scientists, environmentalists, and industry leaders. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for Charlie to speak. The chair of the Global Environmental Oversight Board, a distinguished woman named Dr. Amelia Sorensen, opened the session. "Dr. Turner," she said, her tone professional but laced with concern, "we've called this meeting to address the findings from the global trials of your enzyme. While your innovation is commendable, we must now consider the unintended consequences." Charlie cleared her throat, stepping to the podium. She'd prepared for this moment, but nothing could have fully prepared her for the weight of the room's collective gaze. "I'm aware of the issues raised by the early field trials," she began, her voice steady. "But we're still in the testing phase. The enzyme was never meant to be deployed on a large scale before extensive environmental impact assessments were completed." Dr. Sorensen held up a tablet, displaying a series of graphs and images. "These are the findings from multiple trials," she said, tapping the screen. "In several locations, ecosystems are showing signs of distress. In one region of India, soil degradation has been linked to the enzyme's breakdown process, affecting local agriculture. In the UK, reports show that the enzyme has altered the pH balance of local rivers, leading to a decline in freshwater species. These are serious problems." Charlie's mind raced. Soil degradation? pH imbalance? These were issues she had never anticipated. She quickly ran through the data in her mind. Could it be that the enzyme was reacting with certain natural elements in ways they hadn't yet understood? "I understand these concerns," Charlie said, trying to steady her nerves. "But I also want to point out that the vast majority of trials have been successful. In areas where the enzyme was applied in controlled environments, plastic waste was broken down at an unprecedented rate, with minimal impact on surrounding ecosystems. We're still in the process of gathering data to refine the enzyme's application." One of the representatives from India, a man named Rajiv Sharma, spoke up. "Dr. Turner, I understand your optimism, but the results are clear. We cannot ignore the damage that has already been done. The enzyme may be helping to solve one problem, but it could very well be creating new, potentially irreversible environmental issues." The room fell silent as Charlie weighed her options. This was a crisis, a real one, and if she couldn't fix it, everything she had worked for, the billions of people who were counting on her solution, would be lost. "I agree," Charlie said, her voice growing stronger. "We need to pause large-scale implementation and reevaluate the enzyme's impact on different environments. I will personally oversee the additional testing to understand the environmental effects. If necessary, we will alter the enzyme's composition to ensure it works without causing harm. I promise you, this is not the end of the road. It's the beginning of a new phase." Dr. Sorensen exchanged a look with the other board members, then nodded. "We will hold off on further deployment until the new studies are complete. But Dr. Turner, you have to understand. The world is watching. If you cannot resolve these issues, it will be difficult for anyone to trust your enzyme again." Later that day, Charlie found herself standing at the podium once again, this time in front of a room full of reporters. The press conference was a necessary evil. The world needed to know that she was addressing the crisis head-on, but she could already sense the skepticism in the air. "Dr. Turner," a reporter from BBC asked, "many are now questioning whether your enzyme is truly a viable solution. What assurances can you give the public that this isn't just another failed experiment?" Charlie took a deep breath, then looked directly into the camera. "I will not back down," she said, her voice firm. "We have an incredible opportunity to solve one of the planet's most pressing issues, but we are also committed to doing it responsibly. We've hit a bump in the road, yes, but it's not the end of the journey. We will fix the enzyme, we will test it thoroughly, and we will make it work. This is about more than just an invention. It's about the future of our planet. And I'm not giving up on that." As she left the press conference, Charlie felt a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The battle had just become more complicated, but it wasn't over. Not yet. She turned to Elon, who had been standing at the back of the room, watching her with quiet admiration. "Well?" he asked. Charlie gave him a weary smile. "We've got work to do. Let's get to it." The next few weeks were a blur of data analysis, urgent meetings, and late-night strategy sessions. Charlie's lab was bustling with activity as her team scrambled to address the unforeseen consequences of the enzyme. She spent hours going over the data from the recent field trials, trying to pinpoint the variables that could be causing the environmental imbalances. But the more she looked, the more complicated the puzzle became. The worst part was the press. After the United Nations meeting, the media was relentless. Headlines like "Charlie Turner's enzyme backfires," "Environmental crisis looms," and "The toxic side of a plastic cure" filled news outlets around the world. The plastics industry, eager to shift attention from the dangers of their own products, pounced on the negative press, casting Charlie's invention as an unpredictable threat. But Charlie wasn't one to back down easily. She knew she had to push forward, to find a way to fix the enzyme and prove to the world that it could still be part of the solution. She had one advantage no one else had: the sheer volume of data. If anyone could fix this, it was her. Late one evening, as Charlie pored over the most recent environmental impact reports, a small breakthrough came in the form of a comment from one of her junior researchers, Emma, a brilliant young scientist who had been working with Charlie for months. Emma had noticed something in the data that no one else had: a pattern. "Dr. Turner," Emma said, her voice filled with excitement as she burst into Charlie's office, "I think I've figured out what's going wrong." Charlie looked up, pushing her glasses back up her nose. "What do you mean?" Emma pulled up a graph on the monitor, highlighting a series of trial sites that showed a consistent anomaly. "Look here. The enzyme works fine in temperate climates, places with a stable balance of natural bacteria and fungi. But in more tropical or arid climates, where the soil and water composition is more dynamic, the enzyme interacts with local microorganisms in ways we didn't expect." Charlie squinted at the screen. Then her face lit up as she began to understand. "So the enzyme is reacting with local flora and fauna, but we didn't account for how those ecosystems would adapt to the introduction of the enzyme?" "Exactly," Emma replied. "In some cases, it's breaking down too fast, disrupting the natural nutrient cycles. In others, it's causing an overgrowth of certain bacteria, leading to the pH imbalances." Charlie felt a surge of hope. This was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. "We need to run additional tests," Charlie said, her voice steady with determination. "If we can isolate the specific microbial reactions in different climates, we can tailor the enzyme to adjust to local ecosystems." The following weeks were a frenzy of experiments, simulations, and field trials. Charlie's team worked around the clock to isolate the specific environmental factors that were causing the enzyme to react unpredictably. Emma, now fully immersed in the project, helped design new versions of the enzyme, each one slightly altered to better suit different environmental conditions. Meanwhile, the pressure from the United Nations and the media was mounting. Global environmental organizations were on edge, demanding a resolution. Senator Brockton, ever the political player, was growing impatient as well, reminding Charlie that their agreement to scale the enzyme was contingent on her ability to resolve the environmental concerns. If she failed to deliver, the partnership with the Plastics Coalition would be in jeopardy. But Charlie couldn't afford to rush. She knew that a hasty solution would only make things worse. The world was watching, and she needed to get it right. One morning, as Charlie was reviewing the latest round of data, Elon dropped by her lab, as he often did during these stressful weeks. "How's it going?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Charlie exhaled slowly. "Better. We're finally isolating the problem, but it's still not perfect. Some of the tweaks we've made are showing promise, but we need more time to validate them in the field." Elon walked over to her desk, his brow furrowed with concern. "Time isn't something we have a lot of right now. The world's on edge. And there's this whole issue with the plastics lobby. They're pushing for a rollback of the agreement if you can't fix this soon." Charlie met his gaze. "I'm not going to rush this, Elon. If we don't fix it properly, the consequences will be worse than doing nothing at all." Elon nodded, his expression softening. "I know. I trust you. But remember, we're not just fighting for the enzyme anymore. We're fighting for the future of the planet." His words stung, but Charlie knew they were true. The pressure was building. If she failed, The momentum of the movement she'd started could easily slip away. The world needed a solution, and it needed it soon. It was a week later when Charlie's team finally cracked it. They had developed a new strain of the enzyme, one that was finely tuned to the local microbiomes of different ecosystems. It worked in both temperate and tropical environments, adjusting its activity based on the unique conditions it encountered. The result was a much more stable reaction, one that didn't disrupt natural ecosystems but still efficiently broke down plastics. Charlie couldn't contain her excitement as she reviewed the final reports. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for Dr. Sorensen at the UN Environmental Committee. "This is it," Charlie said when Sorensen answered. "We've cracked it. We've created an enzyme that works in all climates, with no harmful side effects." Dr. Sorensen's voice was cautious but hopeful. "Are you certain?" "I'm confident," Charlie replied, smiling for the first time in weeks. "We've tested it in the field, and we've got the data to prove it. This is the solution we've been waiting for." Charlie and her team quickly arranged for a series of global field trials, this time in various climates to confirm the enzyme's effectiveness. With the new version of the enzyme ready, it was time to prove to the world that her solution could work on a global scale, without causing further harm to the environment. As the trials progressed, the news began to change. Headlines started shifting from fear and skepticism to cautious optimism. The press now focused on the unprecedented success of the latest enzyme iteration and the promise it held for cleaning up the world's plastic waste. But for Charlie, the real work was just beginning. She met with the Plastics Coalition and Senator Brockton to present the new, refined version of the enzyme. The negotiations were tense, but Charlie held her ground. This time, she demanded full transparency and ethical guidelines for the distribution of the enzyme. The Plastics Coalition, wary of further public scrutiny, agreed to her terms. With the revised enzyme now in place and global trials showing promise, Charlie was ready to take the next step. The world wasn't just waiting for the solution to plastic pollution. It was waiting for a leader who could guide them toward a sustainable future. Charlie wasn't just an inventor anymore. She had become a symbol of hope, a beacon in the fight against climate change. As she stood at the front of the room during a global summit on environmental innovation, Charlie spoke to an audience of scientists, policymakers, and industry leaders. "We've taken the first step," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "But this is only the beginning. We have the technology, we have the knowledge, and we have the power to change the course of our planet. Together, we will fight plastic pollution. Together, we will ensure that the Earth survives and thrives for generations to come." The room erupted into applause, and Charlie felt a sense of pride that she hadn't felt in years. She had fought through adversity, and now, she was leading the world into a new era. The future was uncertain, but Charlie knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop until the job was done. The success of the new enzyme spread quickly, from scientific journals to news outlets, from environmental activists to corporate boardrooms. The breakthrough Charlie and her team had made wasn't just a victory for science. It was a victory for the planet. Yet, with the rising attention came new challenges, new expectations, and new players eager to be part of the solution. Charlie found herself in the spotlight more than ever before, attending global summits, giving keynote speeches, and meeting with political leaders. It was exhilarating but exhausting. She was no longer just a scientist working in a lab. She was now a symbol of hope for a world desperately seeking solutions. One crisp morning, as Charlie sat in her office at the newly established Turner Global Environmental Center, her assistant, Rachel, knocked gently and entered. "Dr. Turner, you have a visitor. He's here to see you, right away." Senator Brockton. Charlie's heart skipped a beat. The last time she had seen Senator Brockton, they had barely spoken after her public stand on ethical standards for the Plastics Coalition. His political maneuvering was never subtle, and Charlie had a feeling this meeting wouldn't be any different. "Send him in," Charlie said, her voice steady but her mind racing. A moment later, Senator Brockton strode into the room, his usual confident, almost smug demeanor in place. His tailored suit and well-groomed appearance made him look every bit the seasoned politician he was. "Charlie, always a pleasure," he said, offering a tight smile as he shook her hand. "What brings you here, Senator?" Charlie asked, gesturing for him to sit. She didn't waste time on pleasantries anymore. She knew Brockton's game. "I'll get straight to the point," Brockton began, sitting down. "The plastics industry is, understandably, quite pleased with the progress we're making on your enzyme. But there's one thing that's been holding them back: public perception. They're willing to invest heavily, but they need assurances that the rollout will be smooth." Charlie leaned forward, a cautious expression crossing her face. "You mean they need to make sure that their profits aren't threatened?" Brockton's smile didn't falter. "Of course. But it's not just about profits, Charlie. It's about leadership. You've built something incredible here, and the world is watching. The question is, are you ready to take your work to the next level?" Charlie raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" "I'm talking about turning this into a global enterprise," Brockton said, leaning in slightly. "We're on the verge of something monumental here, and you're the one who has the potential to lead the charge, not just in the scientific community, but in the business world too." Charlie frowned. She knew exactly what Brockton was suggesting: turning her groundbreaking discovery into a massive, multinational operation. But she also knew that with such a move came compromises, ethical compromises, environmental compromises, and personal compromises. She wasn't sure if she was ready to make that leap. "I'm not interested in selling out," Charlie said firmly. "I started this project to help the planet, not to line anyone's pockets." Brockton's expression hardened, but he didn't back down. "I'm not suggesting you sell out, Charlie. I'm suggesting you take the reins of a movement that could change the world, and that could also create the financial backing needed to fund future projects. We're talking about global environmental restoration on a scale that's never been attempted before." Charlie felt a wave of uncertainty. She had always been passionate about the science, about solving the problem. But now, the weight of what he was offering felt immense. This wasn't just a scientific endeavor anymore. It was a business, a global initiative that could shape the future of both industry and the planet. "I'll think about it," Charlie said finally, though she wasn't sure what thinking about it even meant at this point. That night, Charlie met with Elon in their favorite coffee shop, a quiet little spot away from the chaos of the world. It was one of the few places where she could truly relax and think without the constant barrage of cameras, politicians, and media. "Do you think I should take Brockton's offer?" she asked, staring into her cup of coffee, her mind still churning with the implications of his proposal. Elon leaned back, considering her question carefully. "I've known Brockton long enough to know he doesn't do anything unless it benefits him somehow. He's not wrong in saying the world needs leadership in this area. But you're right to question his motives." "Then what should I do?" Charlie asked, looking at him with genuine uncertainty. She'd always trusted Elon's judgment, but this time, the stakes felt impossibly high. Elon smiled, his usual confidence evident, but his eyes held a trace of concern. "What are you really trying to accomplish here, Charlie? If you want to save the planet, you need to be able to scale up the solution. You can't do that without resources. But you also can't lose sight of the reason you started this project in the first place. If you decide to go down this path, you need to make sure the science stays at the forefront, and that the world's best interests come before profits. Do you trust yourself to keep that balance?" Charlie sat in silence for a moment, contemplating his words. He was right. This wasn't just about finding a solution to plastic pollution. It was about how to integrate that solution into a world that was run by profit, politics, and power. It was a delicate balance, and one that she wasn't sure she was ready to strike. "I'm not sure I can trust anyone else to put the planet first," she said quietly. "You don't have to trust anyone else," Elon replied with a small grin. "You just have to trust yourself." The following week, Charlie made the difficult decision to move forward with Brockton's proposal, but on her terms. She agreed to the idea of scaling the enzyme globally, but she also insisted on full transparency, ethical oversight, and strict environmental standards. If the plastics industry wanted to be part of this solution, they would have to meet her conditions. The announcement was made at a global summit, broadcast live to millions of people around the world. Charlie stood at the podium, flanked by industry leaders, environmental activists, and world leaders. Her speech was clear and unwavering. "We are at a crossroads," she said, her voice strong. "For years, the world has been drowning in plastic pollution. But today, We take the first step toward cleaning up our oceans, our land, and our future. This is not just a victory for science. It's a victory for humanity. Together, we will turn the tide on plastic waste. But we will do it ethically, responsibly, and with the well-being of our planet at the forefront. I will lead this movement, and I will ensure that every step we take is one that benefits the Earth, not just business. The world was watching, and for the first time in a long time, Charlie felt the weight of what she had just promised. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she was ready to walk it, no matter the cost. The following months were a whirlwind of action. Charlie's vision was becoming a reality, but not without a fight. The global rollout of the enzyme required massive coordination between governments, private sectors, and environmental groups. While many were eager to see the planet saved, others remained skeptical of both the science and the business motives behind it. There were protests from local communities worried about the sudden influx of new technologies, debates in the media over the true environmental impact, and of course, the political wrangling that came with any global project of this magnitude. But despite the pushback, the momentum was undeniable. Charlie's enzyme, refined and tested to work in various ecosystems, was now being deployed across the globe. Oceans that had once been choked with plastic waste began to show signs of life again. Marine animals, previously threatened by plastic ingestion, were slowly returning to their natural habitats, and the world began to take notice. In coastal villages from the Pacific Islands to the shores of the Caribbean, the first field trials were a success. In small, controlled environments, the enzyme was introduced into the ecosystem in carefully calibrated doses, designed to break down plastic waste without harming local wildlife. While challenges remained, such as occasional shifts in bacterial populations or slight imbalances in the water chemistry, the results were undeniable. One particular trial in the Philippines became a model for others. The coastal city of Cebu had long struggled with waste management, with plastic pollution fouling beaches and surrounding waters. Charlie visited the site personally, walking along the newly cleared shoreline, breathing in the salty air. The sight of crystal-clear water, something that had once been impossible to imagine, moved her deeply. "You did it, Charlie," Elon said, standing next to her, a rare look of awe on his face. "You really did it." Charlie nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We're just getting started." But as Charlie's success grew, so did the opposition. Despite her insistence on transparency, there were still powerful industries and political factions determined to undermine her work. The Plastics Coalition, while publicly supportive, continued to lobby for changes in how the enzyme was distributed. Some feared its rapid deployment would destabilize the waste management market or lead to unforeseen consequences in other industries. Senator Brockton, ever the pragmatist, had become an ally of sorts, but even he was starting to show his true colors. In a private meeting with Charlie and her advisors, he raised a new concern. "Charlie," he began, his tone less cordial than before, "this is bigger than any one person. The rollout of your enzyme is a massive undertaking, but it needs to be profitable if it's going to scale. I'm talking about patents, global licensing, and market control. The Plastics Coalition wants to ensure that you're not left behind in the business of your own invention." Charlie's expression tightened. "I'm not in this for the money, Brockton. You know that." "I understand," he replied, his voice smooth. "But you're not just dealing with an environmental problem. You're dealing with the global economy. And if you want this to succeed in the long term, you'll need to make some hard decisions." For the first time, Charlie felt a pang of uncertainty. She had never been motivated by money, but Brockton was right about one thing. The scale of this project meant that decisions about business and economics would inevitably be tied to its success. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she would need to navigate this new world carefully, balancing the need for profit with her unwavering commitment to the planet. As the enzyme continued to roll out globally, Charlie's work began to attract even more attention. Environmental groups hailed her as a hero, and the media dubbed her the savior of the oceans. She was invited to speak at international summits, and her face graced the covers of magazines from Time to National Geographic. But Charlie knew that none of this would matter if the world didn't follow through on the hard work required to make real change. She used her newfound platform to push for more than just the plastic enzyme. Her true mission, she now realized, was to create a new model for sustainability, one that could be replicated in every industry. If the world could learn to take responsibility for the things it created, it could solve the many crises that loomed on the horizon. It wasn't just about cleaning up the oceans. It was about rethinking how humanity interacted with nature as a whole. "I'm not here to sell a product," Charlie told an audience at the Global Sustainability Conference. "I'm here to start a movement that asks the tough questions. How do we reduce waste before it's even created? How do we invest in solutions that last, not just in technology, but in our hearts and minds? And how do we make sure that every step we take is one that honors the earth, not exploits it?" The crowd erupted into applause. Charlie felt a surge of hope as she looked around the room. The seeds of change had been planted, and they were beginning to grow. Though Charlie was becoming a global icon, the future was far from guaranteed. Climate change, deforestation, and growing geopolitical tensions all loomed on the horizon. The success of her enzyme was just one piece of the puzzle, and Charlie knew she couldn't afford to rest on her laurels. There were still battles to be fought, political, scientific, and ethical. But as Charlie stood on a rooftop in New York City one evening, watching the sunset over the skyline, she felt a sense of peace. The world was chaotic, and she couldn't fix every problem alone. But she had done something. She had made a dent in the seemingly insurmountable problem of plastic pollution, and that dent was growing. Elon joined her, a rare moment of quiet between the two of them. "Do you ever think we're doing enough?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Charlie smiled, looking out at the city. "We're doing everything we can, and that's all anyone can ever ask for." Years later, the world would look back at the moment Charlie Turner confronted Elon Musk and the Plastics Coalition with the enzyme that changed everything. It wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was the catalyst for a global movement towards sustainability. The enzyme, now a cornerstone of waste management worldwide, had cleared billions of tons of plastic from oceans, rivers, and landfills. New technologies had emerged, inspired by Charlie's vision, and businesses began to shift their models toward more sustainable practices. Global plastic production was down by nearly 70%, and recycling rates had skyrocketed. But Charlie's legacy wasn't just in the reduction of plastic pollution. It was in how she had redefined the role of science and industry in creating a better world. She had shown the world that it was possible to innovate for good, to create solutions that didn't just benefit the bottom line but benefited the planet, too. And as Charlie stood before a new generation of young scientists, activists, and innovators, she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The work wasn't over, but the road ahead had never looked brighter. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?